В общем, да, если желание.
Exactly. And he's entertaining to have these.
That's right. Yeah, we'll see.
Actually, it's good.
Yeah. Да, не знаю, что это. Ну, второй раз. Легче был, чем нам это все. Не хочется делать много.
Yay. So 10.
Do you want your wings out or?
I don't need them all. Yeah, it's better to give more space. I mean, doesn't really
When you're ready.
like,
What are you taking out?
yeah,
How long have you been in Rapo?
yeah.
This is my last. This is your last.
Okay.
I remember 6 months.
I'm live, truly live.
YouTube streaming too.
Wow.
Everybody in the room can hear us.
Whoa.
There's only one person on there.
Two decks that are up. Same for your other deck.
Oh yeah, so just the other one.
And then you have to click on a slide just to get it.
Okay, good one, good point. Yeah.
So just click on the slide again.
Okay. Yeah, we have a few minutes still. I think I'll have them once I start messing up.
I don't see any familiar faces. If you have more of my own lessons,
Sure. You can be the police.
I do like that. Yeah, but everybody hears And then,
It's the
just so you
PMPPD.
know, my students, so there's 60 PMP students. There's also 4 in that M section. So you could choose, 64 hopefully is okay to you. If you could choose a cheaper drop.
Exactly, some of them will drop. Yeah.
Yes.
No, just, yeah. Much more interesting.
Can you please the line?
Cut out the middleman.
People watching this part.
Exactly, exactly. They're watching you too? No, just kidding. All right, let's get started. Welcome everybody at both sites. Welcome to the most fascinating class you will ever take, or your money back. Just kidding, just kidding. Don't want to get in trouble with the university. So this is CSCP 546. The official title of the class is data mining, but it should probably be called machine learning at this point. So, just truth in advertising. I'm Pedro Domingos. I will be the instructor. It's great to meet you. I hope we will have a great time, these coming 10 weeks, and also that you will learn a lot of useful things. Please feel free to ask questions at any time. Also to share your thoughts, right? So you can yell at any point, it's a lie, it's a lie. I know from my experience that it's a lie. And then maybe future generations will benefit, okay? So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to start with some logistics, and then just an intro to what machine learning is, and why it's important and might be worth your while, and the basic concepts, a preview of what we're going to do in this class, and then after the break in the second half, we will start on what is the main part of the class, which is what's called supervised learning, and we will see what some of the main issues are there, and then we'll take it from there next week. Okay. So to start with the logistics. As I mentioned, my name is Pedro Domingos. Here's my email. Please feel free to send me email with questions or deranged rants at any point. My office is CSC 648, and my office hours are right before class. I know that you guys, unlike us professors, actually have a life, so you might not be here during the day, so we try to have our office hours at the most convenient time. But again, if you can't make these office hours, you can send us email and try to schedule something at a time that works for everybody. So your amazing TAs are Angli Liu and Fereshte Sedegi. I'm not sure if they're here right now, but in case they aren't, you will soon meet them because they're in charge of making your life hard. Here are their emails. Again, you can send email to them. Actually, the office hours are not, their office hours are the same. So Tuesdays at 5:30, right before class. The TA offices are actually not on my slides yet because I didn't have them when I was making the slides, but they're on the website. Apropos of which, for all things related with this class, this is the go-to place. It has all the info, like for example our offices and office hours and whatnot. Also, there's a rough schedule of the class, and I've actually posted roughly the rough slides for the whole class, so you can go there and preview. And I also highly recommend that before you come to class every week, just scan through the slides for that week, right? It won't take you very long, but it really, really increases what you get out of the class, right? Because then you won't just be finding your bearings, you already know roughly what we're covering, and so you'll get more out of it. And then after class, you can go, and study them and the book and whatnot. The assignments will also be posted there. We'll talk about that in very shortly, and and a few other things, like for example, another important resource for the class is the mailing list. You are all automatically signed up for the mailing list, so you shouldn't have to do anything. So, but if we send email to the class and you don't get it, please yell. Any quibbles with that? Hey, I didn't get the email. Yeah. Never mind. To continue the logistics onto everybody's favorite part, the evaluation for the class. So here's what we have carefully optimized after many years of practice. There's no final, there's no midterms. What we're going to have is 4 assignments. Each assignment covers 2.5 weeks of the class. Each one of them is worth 25% of the grade. They will be handed out on weeks 2, 4, 6, and 8. So the first one you will get a week from today. And the one that you're going to get a week from today actually is going to cover some stuff that will only be covered the week after, but the goal is for you to ideally start doing the assignment as soon as you get it. So the best time to practice you know, the material covered in one lecture is the week after that lecture, right? We're not doing an assignment every week because we want you guys to have more flexibility. But ideally, you know, you would do this stuff week by week and not leave it all to the last moment, right? That never happens, right? That's what I thought. We don't do anything at the last moment either. And then the assignments are due 2 weeks later. So the assignment that's out on week 2 is due on week 4, and then the final assignment is due on the last class. So are these assignments? We will try our best to make them both as fun and as useful as possible. They will be a mix of 2 things. One thing will be implementing machine learning algorithms, and you know, like decision trees and you know, nearest neighbor and so forth, and running them on real data sets. So we actually wanted to have as much as possible the real experience of being a data scientist. Of course, we have tried to simplify things so that it fits into, you know, a 1 or 2 week assignment. But you know, some of the things that we might use are, for example, a data set of clickstream data from a real e-commerce website that went, you know, belly up in the glory days of 2000, but somebody grabbed their data, right? And you know, performed a great service to humanity that way. Also, the Netflix data set is another one that we've often used. There was actually, you know, we first used that data set when the prize was announced and was live. And there was actually a student in this class who was learning about machine learning for the first time. He got interested in it, kept playing, and wound up being a member, you know, about a year later of one of the 2 winning teams. So bear that in mind. If something like that happens this quarter, maybe we'll do the same thing, right? And if you win $1 million, remember your old friends. So the other part of the class is more, you know, math exercises, right? Stuff to solve, things to do, for 2 reasons. Because that is important in its own right. There's a significant component of you know, mathematics and that type of understanding in machine learning. So it's something that you want to practice in addition to doing coding and the more usual things. And also because there's more in the class than we can reasonably cover in just the actual, you know, coding part of the assignment. Okay, and typically each assignment will have a mix of the 2, so you don't get too bored. But you know, but this will vary, you know, assignment by assignment. Any questions? Yep. So here's for Ashley, by the way. Anything that goes wrong with the class, you can blame on her and Angli.
In previous courses, there were usually like 4 to 5 late days with you know,
Sure.
certain penalties or something.
Yeah, same thing here. Again, you can find all that info on the website, but the late policy is you can hand in homeworks up to a week late at a penalty of 10% of the grade per day. And this usually covers most people's needs, right? So it's a reasonable balance, I think. Other questions? Okay, very good.
Question, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
What's the average time for a homework test?
It's hard to say. It varies by person and it even varies by assignment. So some people do them very quickly. Some of them take longer. So I don't think I mean, I get these surveys, right, of the class evaluation, you know, year after year, but I don't think that I can confidently say it's going to take you X time. So what I would do is, you know, plan for the worst case and hope for the best.
And what's the worst?
Well, the worst case is it'll consume your life and, you know, and your family will hate you and...
That's already happened.
Okay, oh, good. Oh, all right. So the only way up is now. The only way, you know, is up now, right? So very good. Yeah. I think. Yeah, I don't want to make up a number, but for example, some students like to do this on the weekends, and it's certainly, you know, I think you could do, you know, the assignment for one of these classes on the weekend. Some of them like to do them during weeknights, and I think if you spend some amount of time on this every weeknight or every other weeknight, that's also something that can work. You know how coding is, right? Sometimes things wind up taking, you know, longer for no good reason. Sometimes they're very quick. I think the math part is more predictable in that sense, and that actually should not take all that long, provided that at that point you understand the material quite well. So, you know, part of the variance in both of these things is like how much more studying after the class do you have to do, you know, until you're ready to, you know, to do the assignments. And again, that will vary, you know, with different people and you know, and with different areas. So, yeah.
Is there any particular language that we are supposed to do?
There isn't a particular language. You can use anything that kind of, roughly makes sense and that the TAs can grade. So if you're thinking of using an unusual language, what you should do is ask either Angli or Fereshte if they're okay with that language. As far as I'm concerned, you can use whatever you want, with the exception of COBOL. Just kidding. More questions? Hey, that'd be fun to do this in class in COBOL. Somebody should try that. You're giving me temptations. Bad idea. Any other questions on the assignments? Okay, very good. So next and very important thing, what are the source materials going to be for this class? This is actually not an easy thing for me, the instructor, because there are some very good machine learning textbooks out there, but they have thousands of pages and millions of equations in them. And they're a lot of pain for the game. If anybody is interested in them, I'm more than happy to point you to them. I do not recommend them as an efficient way to do this class. What I have done is we're using a couple of different things. So the first one, this class is going to be full of special effects. This was just the first one. So the first one is Tom Mitchell's machine learning textbook. This is actually a very old textbook by now. It's from 1997. And at the time, it was actually the first, sort of like real machine learning textbook. And this book is outdated, and it's a little bit too light for what machine learning is today. But as an introduction to machine learning, it's really unbeatable. You can read it fairly easily and get a lot of the concepts, and it closely follows a lot of what we will be doing in class. Okay? So, and it's not a very big textbook. It's ridiculously expensive. I apologize for that. It cost $200 when it came out. It cost $150 when it came out, and then the price declined. And then when machine learning got hot, the price went up again. Right? So now it costs about $2,000. Well, it doesn't, but McGraw-Hill would do that if they could. not. Anyway, this is a family show. So. The other main textbook that is required for the class is a textbook to cover the things that aren't covered in Mitchell. And for this, I've tried various things over time. I think probably the best one is the one that we're going to use, this time. It's the book Pattern Classification. This is actually the second edition of a classic textbook that came out in the, I think, late 60s. That was by Duda and Hart. And, it was called Pattern Classification and Scene Analysis. People didn't call this machine learning back then. But it already covered some of the things that we're going to cover here. It's been greatly updated by Peter Stork. And again, it's a somewhat easier textbook than some of the others, that are sort of like much longer and heavier and sort of like and math filled. So these two books, I think, are the two mainstays of the class. Another thing that I greatly recommend, even though it's not required, is a book called The Master Algorithm, which I actually wrote last year. This book is not a textbook. It's a popular science introduction to machine learning. But it actually gives you a better map of the field and a better intuitive understanding of the algorithms than any of the textbooks. Of course, I'm the author, so I'm biased when I say this, but others have said it as well. So this is a very good thing to, for example, start reading in advance, or even coming to the lectures. The book is actually largely based on the machine learning classes that I've taught, so it will recognize a lot of points of contact. So there's even a rough correspondence between the chapters of the book and the weeks of this class. So it's I think a very good complement. And then also, as needed, we will use various papers for things that maybe are important but not very well covered in the textbook. In fact, this very week you have a paper to read. It's again by this author, Pedro Dominguez. For some reason, I'm a big fan of him. It's called A Few Useful Things to Know About Machine Learning. And this is a 10-page, this is a paper that came out in the Communications of DCM a couple of years ago. It's a short paper, it's 10 pages. It's very easy to read, it's not very technical. And it was born of my frustration with there being all these things that people really need to know about machine learning, but are either not in the textbooks or they're so buried that you can't find them. And then I see people making mistakes and wasting years and millions of dollars to rediscover something that is already known. And that book, I think, is a very good thing to read before you even start on the class. That paper, it's not about specific algorithms. It's about what are the key issues in machine learning and what are the key pitfalls to avoid. And we'll touch on some of them today, but the others are actually things that you will see sprinkled throughout the class. Some other resources that you have are, of course, this being the distance version of the class. The classes will be online. They're, of course, also live streamed. There's one more thing that, that actually can also come in very useful, which is the previous edition of this class actually turned into a Coursera MOOC. And so the lectures from that class are available online. And you can go to the Coursera site and just watch the lectures as previews without actually enrolling in that course, which would be pointless given that you're doing this one. But those lectures are very useful, potentially very useful, I think, in two different ways. One is as a preview, right? So the lectures of this class will only be posted after they recorded, right? So barring time travel, you can't look at the lectures of future lectures, but you can already look at the ones on Coursera if you want to get a feeling for what things are. The other thing is that, of course, the lectures that will be posted from this class are going to be 3-hour-long things. The Coursera lectures are broken into these little 10, 15-minute segments where you say, oh, I'm unclear on this particular topic that we covered in class today, and you can go straight to that one and just study that part, right? And you can even do the Coursera fun things of like speeding it up, so I go, or slow it down, so you have more time to absorb it, and my voice gets deeper and whatnot. I mean, the class, obviously, as I taught it then and I will teach it now, are not exactly identical, so there's a little bit of a caveat there. But they'll be pretty similar. So I think, and what I found is that the students often find this very useful, to come to class and then just go to specific segments for particular things that they had a problem. Okay? Questions about the materials? Yeah.
I have book Pattern Recognition by Bishop. Do you think it's a useful book?
Yeah, so very good. So the book Pattern Recognition by Chris Bishop is one of the leading machine learning textbooks. It's an excellent textbook. If you want to study it, I definitely encourage you. What are the pros and cons of that book? As you will find out soon, there's more than one school of machine learning, and Chris Bishop is a Bayesian. So that book is a Bayesian take on everything. Sometimes the Bayesian take is very appropriate. Sometimes it's really making things, very much more complicated than it needs to be. It's also a very math-heavy textbook. It's actually the most math-heavy of all the textbooks. So if you like math and you're into Bayesian machine learning, that book is perfect for you. If you'd like to have more, for example, of a mix of math and coding, for example, Kevin Murphy's textbook is also a good one. And again, we're all talking in the many hundreds, thousand page range. Kevin Murphy is also a Bayesian, but less fanatical than Chris. I know all these people, so. Don't tell them what I told you. There's also the book by Friedman, Hastie, and Tibshirani, which is very good, but it's more frequentist, so it's kind of the opposite of Bayesian. It is, however, a book very much by statisticians and for statisticians, so they really don't focus very much on the computational side, which is actually the more important and interesting, I think, for us here. So again, it's not quite ideal. There is a short version of that textbook that was actually co-authored by Daniel Witten, who's actually here at UW, and has a lot of exercises in R and things like that. That's a very nice book to study. If you were going to study machine learning on your own, I would actually recommend that book as a good thing to play with. It doesn't cover a lot of the things that we cover in this class. So that book actually is kind of like that's somewhat too low and succinct of a level. So all of these books have their pros and cons, including the ones that we're going to use. But yeah, if you have Bishop, that's definitely a good investment. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
For the math part, do you have any recommendations on refreshers and things we should be sharpening our skills on?
Yes, so definitely a good question. What I will try to do is, as we go through different parts of the class where different types of math are relevant, remind you of good things to study then. What are some examples of these things if you want to start looking at them? Definitely Probability and Statistics 101. I assume that everybody here has been exposed to that. If you haven't, now is the time to go and brush up on that. You can take any Prob Stats 101 textbook and online classes and whatnot. Having said that, it's possible to teach machine learning in a very stat-heavy way. I've actually tried to minimize that. So you will no doubt need some amount of statistics, but if you're not, if your stats is a little rusted, right, you took it, in your freshman year a long time ago and weren't particularly fond of it because it was boring, right? Because you didn't know it would be used in machine learning, that won't kill you, but it's definitely, one good thing to kind of brush up on. Another one is linear algebra, right? So some parts of machine learning use a lot of linear algebra. Another one is calculus. When we get to things like neural networks, and deep learning and all that exciting stuff, it's very much based on calculus. So that'll be a good time to brush up on your calculus or pick it up if you haven't. Again, I try to not make it too mathematical, but we are going to be talking about gradients and gradient descent and things like that. So yeah. Like for example, next week I'm going to talk about rule induction. That will involve a little bit of first order logic, which again is something that I assume people have some exposure to, but whether or not you do. So almost week by week there'll be a different type of math that's involved, which is part of what makes machine learning fun. Yeah. More questions? Okay, very good. And remote folks, remember, we are virtually in the same room, so please, give us your questions and thoughts as well. This is not just a TV show. Here's the question?
Yeah, the question is, where do we get these books?
Oh, so the books are available at the university bookstore, at least the required ones. And you can also just order them, right, on Amazon or your favorite online source, which, for you guys might actually be the most convenient since you probably don't, walk by the bookstore all that much. On the class page, I actually have links to the home pages of the books. They're not necessarily the home pages of the publishers. They're often the home pages of the authors, and they have more material and that useful stuff. But you can go from there to Amazon or whatever, and you can also just order it on your cell phone right now. So one of those should work. Yeah. More questions? Okay, so that's the logistics. Again, remember the web page and the forum and the mailing list. These will be your main resources. If you have questions, if you think one thing I forgot to say. If you have a question that you think is just of interest to you, email it to me or to Fereshti or Angli. If you have a question that you think is of interest to the whole class, email it to the class list, and then we will reply to the class list. We reserve the right to embarrass you by replying to a private question in public, right? So we might, if contrary to your modesty, your question is actually of great interest to everybody else, we will CC the list when we answer it. Another great resource is the forum, right? Often when you're sort of like having when you're doing an assignment and you're wondering, how do I do this or what, what's that? Often the forum is how you get the quickest responses. But we will be monitoring the forum as well. Okay. All right. So that's the logistics. So now let's start with the class. And again, this first hour is going to be more sort of like a cocktail party. Overview of machine learning, which is very useful in its own right? You'll be able to brag to your friends at parties that you know machine learning, and I will provide you some ammo for that, right? Never underestimate the value of that. But of course, it's not going to be the real stuff that's going to start a little bit later. So let me start by trying to persuade you that machine learning is a worthwhile field of study. Of course, these days it's very much in the news, and maybe I don't need to do this, but you might suspect indicators of how important machine learning has become. So, for example, there's this guy named Bill Gates that you might have heard of. He says that a breakthrough in machine learning would be worth 10 Microsofts. That's, I don't know, $4 trillion, give or take, depending on what Microsoft is worth now. This is how much he thinks that machine learning can add to the computer industry and to its applications. And my hope is that by the time you're done with this class, you will think of that as an underestimate. Right? Machine learning will not only take over the entire world economy, and everybody except us will be unemployed, it will also make the world economy much larger. So maybe machine learning is worth 100 Microsofts, right? We're very techno-optimistic in this department, as you can tell. And then right after that, of course, the robots will take over and humanity will be exterminated. But hey, you got to take it as it comes. Here's another famous quote on the internet. This is from Tony Tether, who used to be the director of DARPA. Right? DARPA is of course the research arm of the Department of Defense, and they're the biggest funders of computer science research in the U.S. and maybe in the world. And of course, they're famous for funding the internet. Well, Tony Tether says that machine learning is the next internet. So if you think of how much the internet changed the world, machine learning is in the process of changing the world by as much, maybe even more. John Hennessy, he's actually a computer scientist, right? He's an author of a well-known text on computer architecture, Patterson and Hennessy. He's now the president of Stanford, and he says that machine learning is the hot new thing. So, these are all very objective people. Prabhakar Raghavan, he used to be the director of research at Yahoo, and he said, this one is kind of like more application specific, but I think it's eye-opening. Web rankings today are mostly a matter of machine learning. You may have heard of PageRank and lots of fun stuff, but the real thing that drives search engines today is learning from the queries that you issue and the things that you click on the pages of results. Okay, so machine learning is very much at the like every time that you use a search engine, whether it's Google or Bing or any other, like Baidu in China, they're using intensively machine learning to find out to decide what to return to you. Greg Papadopoulos, he's a well-known technologist and investor and whatnot, and he says that machine learning is going to result in a real revolution. Okay, and I would argue that the revolution is already beginning, but it has still very far to run. Jerry Yang, founder of Yahoo, says that machine learning is today's discontinuity. Maybe part of that discontinuity is the death of Yahoo, but hey, life is all about creative destruction. But he did say that, and I think it's a good way to think about it. It is a discontinuity. It's a change that's not just evolutionary. It's a whole change. It's a game-changing development, right? It changes the way things are done in IT in pretty much across the board, and I think in a lot of other areas as well. And finally, to end, with one more quote from Microsoft. Actually, Steve Ballmer, now former CEO of Microsoft, says that machine learning today is one of the hottest aspects of computer science. And I could give you more and more quotes like this, but that would be boring, right? Hopefully, this gives you the idea that certainly a lot of people are very excited about machine learning, and and the question is why, of course. And the other question is, well, what is machine learning exactly, right? And if you read about machine learning in the media or hear about it, you often get a very fuzzy, often inaccurate notion of what machine learning is. Machine learning is actually a very well-defined field of research that is 60 years old, and that's what you're going to learn here. And by the time you're done with this class, you won't need to have a definition of machine learning because you'll know what it is. But just as a way of introducing it, here's one possible way to define machine learning. Machine learning is the automation of automation. The thing that makes computers so powerful, right, is that they automate things that used to have to be done by people. As a result of which they become vastly cheaper, so more people can afford them. You can do way more of them. And also you can do things that weren't even imaginable before. However, this creates a new bottleneck, which is the computer scientists themselves, right? The bottleneck used to be the factory worker or the office worker. Now the bottleneck is the software engineer, which is why we all get paid so much, right? We are the new bottleneck. Well, machine learning is about stealing from the thieves, right? The idea is computer scientists put everybody else out of work, and then we, the machine learners, put computer scientists out of work. And that's why you're here. Because when all those jobs are gone, you want to be one of the few left standing, okay? And of course, you will be making orders of magnitude more money, right? Or somebody will. Or we will see how all of that plays out. But I think thinking of machine learning as automating automation, it's just two words, but I think it kind of captures what the idea is. And how do we do that? Well, this is what this class is about. The whole concept in machine learning is that we no longer have to program computers. Programming is fun, right? I think we all like to program, but it's also a lot of pain, right? There's a lot of, there's the beautiful vision of the system that you're going to build, and you enjoy that for, 30 seconds, and then there's, months of making it come true, right? There's all the details to take care of, there's all the debugging, there's all the integration, there's all the pain. And the idea in machine learning is that, no, you don't have to do that anymore. You can tell the computers at a much higher level what to do, and they will learn. to program themselves by looking at data. Okay? So the more data you have, the more powerful machine learning gets, which goes a long way towards explaining why machine learning is exploding. Right? The available data is exploding, and machine learning is piggybacking on that to become better and better. Okay? So the mantra of machine learning is we're lazy. We don't like to work. The hardworking people can be in their office coding all night long. We use machine learning. We let the data do the work for us, and we go to the beach. Right? I think it's a good value proposition. Okay? Of course, machine learning is not magic, and we will see shortly, what you can and can't do with machine learning today, and it's very important to have that notion. But here's a slightly more precise way to define what we're going to be talking about in this class. So first of all, here's how traditional programming works, right? So you have the computer, the data goes in, right? And there's a program that goes into the computer, right? This is what von Neumann computers do. They take data and programs as input. The program runs on the data, and then out comes the output, right? This is what the information age up to now has been powered by. This is how we know how to do things. Well, machine learning is a very strange idea, actually. Machine learning is turning this around and actually having the output now be one of the inputs. So in a machine learning system, the data goes in and the desired output goes in as well. So what the learning algorithm is doing is looking at the input and looking at the output and asking itself, how do I turn this input into this output? And then once it figures that out, it outputs a program. So the output of a machine learning algorithm is another algorithm. So a machine learning algorithm is in some sense a master algorithm, which is why my book is called The Master Algorithm. And then that program then becomes this program that does its job as if it had been written by a person. Okay? So you can think of machine learning as kind of like the opposite, the inverse of traditional programming, where instead of the program going in and the output coming out, you actually have the output going in and the program coming out. Okay? Any questions so far? Very good. Now you might ask yourselves, this all sounds too good to be true, right? Is machine learning some kind of magic, right? Writing software is not easy. How come, these programs can do it? Well, they can do it within certain limits, but here's a metaphor that I think explains very well where machine learning gets its power. And this is the idea that, no, machine learning is not magic. It's really a lot more like gardening or farming, right? If you look at the way things have worked since the dawn of the industrial age, what happens is that we have to make our artifacts in factories every step of the way, starting with the raw materials, making the subcomponents, the subcomponents down to individual bolts, and assembling them into very complex things like cars and TVs and airplanes. This is extremely costly and time-consuming, right? It's also very demanding on the engineers, right? We have to get everything right. Now compare that with the life of a farmer, right? Farmers also produce something very important, namely the food that we eat. But they don't have to do that. They just plant the seeds in the ground, and then they make sure that they maybe put some fertilizer down, make sure that they get enough rain, or maybe irrigate them if needed, kind of monitor things. But then the crops grow out of the ground all by themselves. Nature actually does most of the work, right? It's amazing, right? Farmers actually spend the winters being bored because there isn't that much to do, right? So machine learning is really doing a similar thing, but for artifacts, right? This in some ways is a strange analogy because what could be lower tech than farming and high tech than machine learning? But in some ways what machine learning is doing is going back to farming, right? So what are the seeds now? The seeds now are the learning algorithms. A seed is a small thing, but a whole tree could grow out of it. And the beauty of machine learning, at least to me, is that the learning algorithms are so simple. You will see in this class some of the simplest algorithms that you've ever seen. And some somewhat more complex ones, right? So there's a range. But what is amazing is that such simple algorithms can yield such powerful and complex results. Again, it's like a seed. A seed is a similar thing, right? And now the nutrients, of course, the nutrients for us are the data, right? The fertilizer and the water for our programs is the data, right? The water and the fertilizer, make the plants grow. The data makes the programs grow, right? We're producing programs instead of crops, but they're fed by data. And the more data that you have, the more they can grow, and until they cover the world, which they're kind of doing these days. And the gardener, of course, is you. You are the gardener, the data scientist, the gardener, right? Again, being a data scientist is very different from being, a more standard computer scientist, because it's not about programming all the details anymore. It's about wrangling the data and the learning algorithm to kind of, make sure that it takes the shape that you want it to take, even if you don't know exactly how it's doing that, right? We often don't understand the machine learning algorithms and what they produce as well as we do the things that we create. On the other hand, they can often do much more. So, there's some trade-off there, but at the end of the day, you still have an easier life than if you were, an ordinary programmer. And of course, the output of this, in the case of the gardener or the farmer, is plants, and in our case, it's programs. Okay? So this maybe is a good picture to keep in mind as we go through this class. All right, so this is, what machine learning is in just a few minutes. But now let's look at some of the things that machine learning is used for in the world today, right? I think in some ways the best argument to study machine learning is just to see, the amazing variety and also importance of things that are done with it today, okay? And what I'm going to do here is just go over a few examples, not random ones. I tried to make it a mix of, I tried to make them different, right, from different areas. I tried to make them be important ones, but also, be different. And also have, a spectrum of more current, very established applications of machine learning, that go back in some cases 10 or 20 years, to recent ones, to ones that are maybe still more in the future, so you can see the full range. But the single thing that I would most like you to get out of this is to start thinking about your own favorite application, maybe what you do in your work, or something else that you're interested in, and how you might apply machine learning to it. Okay? I've heard it said by several people who should know, and I agree that the easiest way to do a successful startup today, in case any of you are thinking about it, is to do machine learning applied to X, where X is something that people haven't applied machine learning to before. Right? If you're the first one to do that, you could have a very big a success on your hands. Of course, then you have to know how to do it as well, which is why you're taking this class. But this is a good thing to think about, is how, and again, I've had many people in this class who have gone back and applied it to, to things that they were doing, whether it was debugging or a search engine or whatever, and, and that makes it, obviously even more interesting. So let me start with one that I already mentioned briefly, and this is and this is web search. I guess I shouldn't I'll do it on this side. Web search. Why does Prabhakar say that web search these days is mainly a matter of machine learning? Traditional information retrieval did not use machine learning at all, right? It was, based on the keywords on the page and things like that. But then people discovered something extraordinarily powerful, which is the following. The whole problem, right, if you're running a search engine, is somebody types in a few keywords, and you need to figure out what the web pages are that they're looking for. This is very hard to do, right, because keywords are very underspecified, in terms of what you're looking for. However, there's a signal that you can learn from, which is, I'm the search engine, you give me the keywords, I select a list of web pages to put before you, right? And then you're going to scan through them, and some things you will not click on, and some things you will click on. And that is an amazing learning signal. Because the things that you don't click on are bad results, presumably. The things that you click on are probably good results, or at least the better results. So if I give you a list of 10 results, and you go straight to the 5th one, that tells me that you probably, are more interested in what's on page 5, on the 5th, page that was returned than on the previous 4. And so in the future, when I get more queries like that one, I can show more pages like the ones that you clicked on. And if you use powerful enough machine learning, you can generalize well beyond the queries that have actually been seen, right? There's a long tail of queries. Some queries, somebody's searching for, I don't know, a Brad Pitt. Well, we already know, there's lots of examples of that. The problem comes with all the queries that are the first one of its kind. And machine learning lets you generalize from the ones that you've seen to the ones that you haven't seen. And of course, the beauty of it in this, as in other domains, is that there is so much data, right? If you're Bing or you're Google or you're Baidu, you get billions of these queries every day, and you can learn from them. So you can learn something very, very rich and powerful, and and more of, they are doing this. So this is web search. Here's a totally different example. Computational biology. We want to have new vaccines. We want to cure cancer. For all these things, the old ways of doing things are kind of running out of steam, right? People used to develop new drugs by trial and error in the lab. That's kind of on its last legs. What people do now is they use machine learning to predict, for example, what drug will work on what disease. Or given the genome of your tumor and your medical history and your genome, what is a good drug to take to attack that tumor without hurting your normal cells? Okay? So biology is a very, very complex field. We want to build a model of the cell, of how the cell works. And we have a lot of volume these days. We have, DNA sequencers, we have microarrays, and there's a Moore's law of microarrays, right? They're putting out data at an amazing rate. A quantity of data that is actually commensurate with the complexity of the living cells that we're modeling. The problem is that the human biologists are not commensurate with either of those, right? It's more data than they can look at, and the models are more complex than one human being can possibly master, and this is where the machine learning comes in, right? Use the machine learning to turn the data into models of the cell, and then those models you can use to probe with different drugs, see what happens under different conditions, see what treatments might work, what things might go wrong, and whatnot, okay? And this, again, is a process that is just in its early stages, but it's already, at least in terms of sort of like, the research world, there's an enormous amount, already going on in this. And there are companies out there that will do things like, recommend a drug for you, using machine learning based on previous, patients' results and whatnot. Here's yet another one. This is actually the oldest major application of machine learning is finance. The first really important application of machine learning in terms of, like just monetary value was in the 80s. Things like neural networks that were used to predict the stock market and foreign exchange fluctuations and things like that. Right? Finance is an area where nobody really understands what's going on, right? Nobody can give you a rule to predict, what stocks are going to go up and down. But machine learning algorithms, if you train them properly, can actually do this with enough accuracy that you could make an enormous amount of money. And indeed, the big investment banks, the hedge funds, etc., they all use, huge numbers of machine learning experts to try and do this type of prediction. Okay? But it's not just the stock market. Think of a bank. When I think of your bank, they actually use machine learning at pretty much every stage of what they do. So when you get a credit card offer, you might wonder why you got that offer. The bank has a model of you, based, for example, on data about you that they bought from other providers. And that model predicts whether you're a good or a bad credit risk, and if you're a good credit risk, they will send you an offer. And then when you send in your application, supposing that you do, they now have more information, and then I have another machine learning program that decides whether to give you credit or not. Same thing when you apply for a loan, for say for a house mortgage. They used to have loan officers at banks. These were people that evaluated loans. These days, they've been almost entirely replaced by machine learning algorithms because they do a better job. Okay? And then, for example, when you get those annoying things that, your credit card was suspended because we suspect fraud, right? We've probably all had that experience. It's a machine learning algorithm that has learned to predict fraud from various, from transactions and unusual things that happen. And that machine learning algorithm triggers the alert. And then, of course, they need to invest the money in things like the stock market and other loans and whatnot. Well, they use machine learning for that as well, as we just saw. And then if they're afraid that you are about to bolt, right, they have this thing called churn prediction. Is try to predict how likely you are to leave for another bank. And then if you are likely and you're a valuable customer, meaning they make a lot of money from you, they might give you an offer to try to entice you to stay with the bank. If you're not a good customer, meaning, you're a starving student and you just have a checking account with $800 in it, they'll probably quietly let you go. Of course, that part they don't publicize, but machine learning gets used for the full spectrum of these things. And finance is interesting because this, machine learningification is farther along than in many other industries, but the same thing is happening pretty much across the board, where machine learning is being used more and more in all the aspects of what a company does. Another very big one is e-commerce. Every e-commerce site worth its salt has a recommender system. Like Amazon has one, Netflix has one. A recommender system is something that learns from the things that you and other people buy or click on or give stars to, for example, in the case of movies. From that, it tries to predict what else you would like and recommends it to you. Right? We're all familiar with this. It's amazing how much, for example, of the business or Amazon or Netflix comes from the recommender system. The best estimate that I've seen, and I've seen it repeatedly, although Amazon will not confirm or deny it, is that a third of their sales come from the recommender system. So machine learning is responsible for a huge chunk of the business that Amazon does. Netflix, the estimate that I've heard is 3/4. So 3/4 of the movies that people watch come from the recommender system. And many people have this experience with Netflix of it recommends them things that they think are silly. Like, why would I like this? It's some obscure British TV show from the 70s. But you already have a subscription, so you stream it or you order it anyway, and then you love it. So somehow that recommender system got to know you surprisingly well, and then people often get addicted to this, which is just fine for Netflix because they want you watching those obscure TV shows that they bought for nothing, as opposed to the blockbusters that they actually lose money on. Okay, so it's interesting how this all plays out. And other types of e-commerce sites also have recommender systems, and they have many other ways as well that they use machine learning. So, for example, they use machine learning to design the layout of the website. Right? You've probably heard of A/B test. Is like, I think we should make this rectangle blue instead of red. Well, they go and test it out and figure out not just whether blue is better than red, but maybe there are some customers for whom blue is better, and then they show blue to those customers. Right? So the entire real estate on a web page on one of these websites is up for grabs and being designed by according to the results of the machine learning. Okay, and then machine learning is also used, for example, at Amazon to do demand forecasting. How much do I need to stock of each good so that I don't run out, but also so that I don't waste transportation and warehouse space and whatnot, and so on. Right? You go to all these different for example, in optimizing the servers, the load on the servers, you use machine learning for that. On the cloud, when you're, pretty much throughout every step in the warehouses, for example, in the case of Amazon, machine learning gets used again, etc., etc. Here's a completely different one, space exploration. This is not as economically important as some of the others, of course, at least for the time being. If you believe Elon Musk, it will be soon. But the idea here is that if you want to explore other planets, it has to be done by a spacecraft and robots that are as autonomous as possible. Right? You have a rover on Mars, the round trip to Earth is 20 minutes, give or take. So if you have to wait for the humans to see what's happening and give their instructions, you're not going to get much done. So the more that robot can function by itself, the better. And at the end of the day, the only way to do that is for the robot to be learning. Or to give a completely different example, NASA at one point sent this spacecraft to Venus. It mapped the whole surface, right? It took photographs of the entire surface of Venus. And now what do they do with that? And this cost billions of dollars. And now what do they do with that? They want to, for example, test theories of the formation of the solar system. And one relevant piece of data is like, what is the distribution of volcanoes on the surface of Venus? Turns out that it says different things about how Venus formed depending on how volcanoes are distributed. But they can't afford to pay people to go and look at each one of these plates, right, of the surface of Venus to say, oh, here are the volcanoes. So again, they use a machine learning algorithm for that. And astronomy. Today we have these amazing catalogs of stars and galaxies and other celestial bodies. In the time of Edwin Hubble, he would go over these plates and say, oh, okay, so here's a star of type X, here's one of type Y, and here's a bird, here's a plane, this was noisy, and here's Superman. But that's not how it's done today. It's done automatically, as a result of which it's both more accurate and orders of magnitude more. Here's another one, robotics. So this is something that robots are actually fairly widespread in industry today, but they're dumb robots that just do a fixed set of motions in a very controlled environment. What is starting to happen, however, and is very exciting, is robots that are flexible and that can do different things on demand. And one example of this is self-driving cars. Right? A self-driving car is a robot. Right? What it does is it drives a car, Why do we have self-driving cars today and we didn't have them 20 years ago? Because they learn. The self-driving car was not programmed to drive by anybody. In fact, we don't know how to program a car to drive. It's like riding a bicycle, right? You know how to ride a bicycle, but you don't know how to write the code, for a robot to ride a bicycle. Your cerebellum knows, but your forebrain doesn't. Same thing with driving a car. What Google has is its cars have driven over 1 million miles. And the car is watching the humans drive, and it's learning from what they do and learning from the things that happen. And it's because of that we now actually have cars that drive themselves. And also because of the machine learning algorithms that we have that make it possible to take advantage of that data that also didn't exist 20 years ago. So it's a combination of the better algorithms that we'll talk about here, and more computing power, of course, and the ability to gather more data. Okay? And and there's things like the Roomba, there's things like the Kiva robots in Amazon's warehouses that move the stuff around. And I think increasingly we're going to see robots, do more and more things out in the world, and eventually, I don't know how far from now, but hopefully in the lifetime of many of us, we will have home robots. Okay, that is still far away, but I think that's where we're headed. Here's another very different one: information extraction. What everybody would like to have is not a web where you issue queries or type keywords and get back answers, right? What we would like to have is we ask questions and we get back answers. Like you ask, Siri, tell me something, right? And you get back the right answer. Okay? For that to happen, the web has to be turned from a bunch of text and hypertext into a knowledge base of facts and rules written in logic that computers can understand and reason with to give you answers. So for that, you need to transform text, which is unstructured, into databases that are structured, and this is what information extraction does. And again, in the beginning, people wrote rules to extract information, right? Like, you're going to go to this website, and it sells CDs, and here's the HTML of the table that has the CD and the title and the price, right? And you write these so-called wrappers that say, well, here's what says where the price begins. But that's very brittle. It doesn't scale, and the following day it doesn't work anymore. So what people do is they learn from examples of the text and the database, whether it's HTML or just plain text or whatever. The machine learning learns to turn the text into the database. Okay, and this is what powers things that actually some of them already in use today. Like, for example, you've probably used Google's knowledge graph or Microsoft Satori, right? They all have their different versions of this, right? For example, if you issue a query, for example, for Brad Pitt, right? These days, you won't just get a list of pages to do with Brad Pitt. You will actually get a little box that has, his vital info and, and all the divorces that he's had and whatnot. Well, maybe not that one, but things like that, right? This actually comes from the knowledge graph, and it was enabled by machine learning. Here's a huge one. And of these, the most recent one, social networks, right? If you look at, things like Facebook and Twitter, right, they do many things, but at heart, they're about what is called the social graph, right? The social graph, we are nodes in that graph, and our friends, right, you are connected by edges in the graph to your friends, okay? And now Facebook wants to mine that social graph for all sorts of interesting things, like recommending things to you because your friends also like them, for example, right? Or maybe promote things to the right people because they will influence their friends to buy them as well, and their friends will influence their friends, and now they can try to optimize, their ad placement this way. Okay? So there's lots of fascinating information to be extracted from social networks, and and companies like Facebook and Twitter are using machine learning big time to do this. Okay? Twitter was more of a latecomer. I mean, even Facebook was a latecomer compared to the likes of Microsoft and Google, but very much these days they do a lot of things with machine learning. Also things like just like tagging your friends' faces in the photos that you take, right? This is done by machine learning, or recognizing various things in pictures and in your posts and whatnot. The essential thing that Facebook and Twitter do is give you a list of posts or tweets to look at. That list was created by a machine learning algorithm. If they just posted them in chronological order, most of them would be too boring. You never get to the interesting ones. So Twitter is continually trying to predict what are the most interesting tweets to show you, and then it shows you those. And same thing with Facebooks and their posts. Often people have this illusion that they're seeing everything, but they aren't. They're seeing only a small fraction. And that fraction is selected by machine learning. If you kept on scrolling through Twitter, finally you'd get to everything that all the people you follow ever posted, but that's not what you see at the beginning. You see the most interesting ones, and it was a machine learning algorithm that did that. And again, that algorithm is learning from vast volumes of data, namely everybody's using Twitter, getting the things shown to them, then they either click on them or don't, they like them or don't, and they learn from that. Okay? So here's another one that is even more recent and still in its early stages, but I think it's going to be a very important one. It's debugging. Right? Debugging is the most painful thing there is about being a computer scientist. Most of you will probably agree with me. So if we could get computers to do one thing for us, it would be the debugging. Well, it turns out that debugging is actually a great application for machine learning in the following way. Fixing the bug is actually still, for the most part, beyond what computers can do today, right? The bug might be very intricate, and this is where our expertise as programmers goes in. But locating the bug, right? Often the hardest part of fixing a bug is just finding where the heck it is in those thousands or millions of lines of code. This is very hard for humans to do and very time consuming, but it's perfect for machine learning because it can gather all of these different signals and increase or decrease the probability that each line contains the bug. And it doesn't have to pinpoint the bug, right? So the existing machine, what are called statistical debugging systems, what they do is they give you a ranked list of places where the bug is likely to be. And if the bug is somewhere in the first 20 things that it returns out of a program with 1 million lines of code, that's already a huge gain. Okay? So we're seeing more and more of this. Some companies like Microsoft are already using it in various forms, and I think it's going to spread more and more. And again, it can learn from all the repositories of, I compiled this, it wasn't right, I changed it, right? And then, here's what happened again, here's what happened when it runs, right? You can run programs to your heart's content to generate, infinite amounts of data, so it's also a very good one for machine learning, okay? And as I said, the most exciting application of machine learning is the one that is not on this slide and that you are going to think of tonight. As you open the refrigerator, you go like, I could use machine learning for X, and that will be your billion-dollar company. Okay? And again, remember your old friends when you become a billionaire. Questions about applications, thoughts about applications of machine learning?
I don't think that gaming would be an area that highly utilizes.
It does. I mean, again,
There's just a lot more.
Yeah, so by the way, if you have a particular area that you're interested in and you're wondering what has been done with machine learning in it, and of course most of them will not be covered here, just ask us. I'm more than happy to give you pointers. Machine learning is used a lot in gaming today, and becoming more so. All the way from characters that are powered by AI, so the characters actually learn about you, making the game more interesting and less predictable, to things like, for example, figuring out the rankings of different players, so that they can match players that are that are fairly even in terms, right? I watch you play games. I watch against other people. The outcome of the game is a result of your skill and their skill, right? So the outcome of one game actually doesn't say how good you are, right? It just says how good you are relative to the person that you just beat or got beaten by. But if you have enough data like this, and again, Microsoft uses this, with the Xbox, to try and give everybody a score as to how good they are, based on the data from the games that they played, and then they suggest, players. Or for example, you want to form teams, right? And, based on those rankings. So yes, it's being used in gaming in a whole bunch of different ways. Yeah. And again, you can probably think of other things. I think what's remarkable in all of this is both the sheer breadth of things that machine learning is being used for, and how individually important each one of these things is. So if you learn machine learning algorithms in some ways, this is the most time efficient thing you could ever learn, because with one machine learning algorithm you could do who knows how many different things. Okay, so let's continue.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, is there a difference between artificial intelligence and machine learning? I sort of get confused between the two terms every now and then.
Yeah. So great question. So what is the difference between AI and machine learning, and also while we're at it, what is the difference between machine learning and big data? Right? Aren't these things all the same? Well, no, they aren't quite the same. Here's one way to think about it. Artificial intelligence is computers doing the things that only humans can, right? It's where we want to get to, right? It's the planet that we want to reach, right? Machine learning is the rocket that gets us there, and big data is the fuel that fuels that rocket, right? Machine learning is actually a subfield of AI. It's a subfield of AI that deals with learning, right? What are the things that human beings can do that machine can't? Well, see, understand language, reason, solve problems, manipulate things, learn. Right? So machine learning deals with one particular human capability that we want computers to acquire as well, and that's learning. As it turns out, of these different capabilities, machine learning these days is by far the most important one, and it's not hard to see why. It's the capability that enables all the others. People once upon a time tried to do AI with no learning, and that didn't get very far. These days what happens is, well, you can learn to see. You can learn to reason. You can learn to understand speech, right? When you use something like Siri, this is being, it's machine learning. That's recognizing, your voice, understanding what you say. Okay, so machine learning is what enables us these days to do all those things that we want to do with AI. And of course, what's making machine learning go is big data, right? The more data you have, the more you can learn. So in some ways, big data, there's a symbiotic relationship between big data and machine learning. Big data enables machine learning, and machine learning is also the justification or one of the main reasons to actually gather and process all that data, right? What do you want big data for? Well, most of the time it is to learn these models that will then be used. So yeah, very good question. Other questions?
So why machine learning is so successful even just right now? Is it because of big data and computational possibilities that we have right now?
Yeah, it's because of three things, right? One is that we do genuinely have much, the progress. I mean, I've been doing machine learning for 20 years since it was an obscure field, and I told people that it would take over the world one day. And it's scary because it's kind of happening now. What has changed, right? We have much better algorithms right now than we did then. Algorithms that are capable of dealing with, noisy data, broken data, different kinds of data, learn different types of things, and you'll see what some of them are in this class. So better algorithms is one part of that. Another part is bigger data, right? As the data grows exponentially, the machine learning algorithms can learn exponentially more as well. So in some ways, machine learning is riding this wave of data, almost for free in some ways. Not entirely, because we have to figure out how to scale the learning algorithms to more data. This is one area that I've done a lot of research in, right? We used to have, our algorithms used to work on 100 or 1,000 examples. Now they work on 1 million or 1 billion. And, this wasn't trivial, but certainly just having more data is a lot of what gives us the power. And finally, it's Moore's law, right? Your algorithms may be very smart and you may have a lot of data, but without a lot of computing, you can't get there either. So it's the combination of these three things. Machine learning, more computing power and more data. Sorry, better algorithms, more computing power, and more data. Yeah.
You see any particular algorithms that are prevalent now? For example, neural network where had dominance. I mean, there was interest in the 60s, I believe.
Yeah.
And it didn't quite work. And now, definitely, I think in the new incarnation, like deep learning.
Yeah. That's another great question. And in fact, if you read, the master algorithm, it's organized around what I call the 5 tribes of machine learning. These are 5 different paradigms, 5 different schools of thought in machine learning. One of them is what's called connectionism. It's, emulating the brain, building neural networks. These days it goes by the name of deep learning, but deep learning is just another name for neural networks. But that's only one of the 5. Another one that I already alluded to is Bayesian learning, and there's 3 more, and we will look at all of them. And the fascinating thing is that decade by decade, you see one of these schools in the ascendant. So for example, in the 2000s, it was, the kernel-based methods, support vector machines and whatnot, that dominated. In the decade before that, the 90s, it was Bayesian methods that dominated. Okay? And neural networks are actually on their 3rd coming. Their first heyday was in the 50s and 60s, and then they died. We're going to look at all of these things and what the algorithms were and where they fell and whatnot. And then they died for 20 years, and then they had their second coming in the 80s, right? People started using them for things like, finance and whatnot. People got very excited, but then they kind of died again because other methods like Bayesian methods and whatnot, seem to work better. And now, amazingly, they're on their 3rd coming, right? So if you talk to the deep learning people, they're like, oh, we've won, we're taking over the world, this is the end of the story, right? But if you just do a naive extrapolation from the past, right, what's probably going to happen is that next decade, somebody else is going to come along and have their next heyday, and who knows where this is all going to end? We don't know. But I think it's very important to realize that there are these different types of machine learning and not just know about one of them and start using it like a hammer for everything, which is what's in danger of happening with deep learning today. How many of you know about Kaggle? Most of you, right? So Kaggle is this website that runs machine learning competitions. You can actually enter a Kaggle competition today, right? Some company or some organization says, we are giving away $1 million, often less, let's say 100,000, for whoever does best at predicting, for example, whether this drug will work or you name it. And then people will just enter it, and often the competitions are won by non-experts. And you look at who tends to systematically win the Kaggle competitions, and it's actually, it's a combination of algorithms from the different schools. Deep learning tends to win on things to do with vision and speech, but then in other areas, it's still kernel machines, support vector machines that win. In other areas, it's decision trees and random forests, which are actually the first type of machine learning that we're going to look at, what's called symbolic learning, and that's what we're going to talk about next week. And it's actually, if you look at the surveys, decision trees are still the most popular machine learning algorithm. So all of these things are in play, and it's like having different tools in your toolkit, right? You want to know what tool to use for what problem, not just try to hit them all with the same hammer. Yeah, that was a great question. Yeah.
So conceptually, why is it more difficult to predict which stock will go up or down than to predict which algo link you're supposed to click? I mean, you have more probability.
Another great question. Here's the thing, is that in a way the stock market is almost by definition the worst possible thing for prediction, because the stock market is about everybody's trying to predict everybody else. So if you find a regularity to exploit, right, and this is what they do, right, you start exploiting it, and in the process of exploiting it, you make it go away. And also other people will notice, they will model what you're doing, and if you're not careful, they will start making money off of you. So, like the stock market is, tens of thousands of really smart people with a lot of resources, all trying to outpredict each other, right? So it's not surprising that it would be very, very hard to predict. And in fact, if you look at what they use, right, they're very cagey, but if you're around them for long enough, you understand what they do, right? They, for example, the typical hedge fund will do something like this: 3,000 stocks in the New York Stock Exchange, right? There's a neural network to predict whether each one is going to go up or down, right? That neural network will select 20 promising looking stocks, and then the final decision will be made by the humans. In some cases, actually, the algorithm does the whole thing. It's completely run by an algorithm. But then these neural networks, they only last for maybe a few weeks or a few months. They have to continually retrain them. They pick something up that works a little bit, and then it stops working again. And it only works in the following sense. If you use a naive algorithm, your success rate will be 50-50, right? You'll predict just as well as flipping a coin. You won't make any money. If you are able to consistently predict with 51% accuracy, you will get rich. If you come to me and say that you're able to predict with 55% accuracy, I'll say that you're deluding yourself. You probably made a mistake somewhere, right? So the amount of prediction that you can do is very, very low, but it's enough to make a lot of money. Contrast that with your habits as a consumer, right? The things that you click on, the products that you like, the kinds of movies that you like. We human beings, we're creatures of habits, right? We have stable tastes. We're much more predictable than we think we are. We tend to do the same things over and over again. Every now and then they change. So this means that the learning problem is actually a lot easier, and you can get a lot higher accuracy with a lot less data. So different machine learning algorithms vary in their difficulty, but sometimes the difficult ones are actually good applications, right? Finance, paradoxically, is a good application of machine learning because nobody has a good theory of it. There's this guy at MIT, Andy Lowe. He's the director of the financial engineering lab, right? Very famous person in this area. He says that in physics, 3 laws predict 97% of everything, and in finance, 97 laws predict 3% of everything, right? So they have theories in finance, but they don't work, so nobody cares anyway. So that creates an opening for empirical methods, which is what machine learning is. One of the things that we're going to look at next week is what are good classes of problems to apply machine learning to, and you will see, these different types come up. More questions? Very good.
So I have a question on your earlier analogy, where you had the program is basically the output, shifting the output as an input, and then the program comes out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense, the master algorithm by itself is a bottleneck, right? Previously, the program was a bottleneck.
Mm-hmm.
Now, soon could be, the algorithm by itself could be the bottleneck, right?
That is another great question. Well, you guys are blowing me away with the questions that you ask. So here's what's happening today, right? I don't know if this entirely answers the question, but it used to be that, everybody was the bottleneck, and then, things got automated with computers, and then the programmers became the bottleneck. You know who's the bottleneck today? It's data scientists. It's people with machine learning expertise. We are the new bottleneck. And we are the new bottleneck in ways that you wouldn't imagine. So, for example, deep learning is the hot area of machine learning, and Peter Lee, who is the director of Microsoft Research, he's one of the people trying to hire people who understand deep learning. He says that the cost of acquiring a top deep learning expert is comparable to the cost of hiring a top NFL quarterback prospect. So the geeks have finally won. Yeah, right? We knew we would win in the end. But I mean, think about what that means, right? That means millions of dollars, right? I mean, there was just this story in the New York Times on Saturday where Fei Li, who's the director of the Stanford AI Lab, she said that one of her graduating students had gotten an offer of more than $1 million a year in salary, right out of grad school. So we are the new bottleneck. I mean, partly deep learning is a bigger bottleneck because nobody knows how to make it work except a very few people. My joke to them is that, and I mean, I also work in deep learning, right? But among other things, but it's like, we spent all this effort trying to make machine learning algorithms comprehensible and easy to use and the models understandable. And their genius was to make them completely incomprehensible and hard to use. So only they can use them, and so they get paid millions of dollars to do it, right? But I mean, I think over time things will get better, and and more people will be able to use machine learning. And and this is definitely have been, we've made a lot of progress in that. There's a lot more progress to be made. I think in the end, and maybe this was your question, will there come a day when we, the machine learners, can also be automated? When there's learning algorithms that are learning about how to do machine learning? There are people already working on that. And yes, eventually, this is what the singularity scenario is, right? The person who first proposed this was I.J. Good, was a statistician who worked with Turing on the Enigma machine in World War II. And he said, once we create a set of machines that are smart enough to design a more intelligent set of machines, then this is going to, run away, right? Because they'll just keep getting, the machines each generation will be smarter than the previous one, as a result of which it will design machines that are even smarter the next time around, and it'll leave us humans in the dust, right? And then Werner Vinge called that the singularity, and Ray Kurzweil made it very popular. So I don't know if that'll happen. I actually don't think that'll happen for various reasons that we needn't go into here. But definitely, there's this very interesting dynamic about where the bottleneck is, and maybe at the end of the day, they'll just be you. You'll be the last person on earth with a job. You'll have a fortune of $1 quadrillion, and the rest of us will all live off taxing you. Yeah.
So, how about the data itself?
Mm-hmm.
I always wonder, that you can be a great data scientist, you can have all those great tools, but if the data itself is not good, right? What does it go? Because I suppose if the data is generated by programs that are, generated by machine learning, that might be fine. But there is this beginning of time where we are now that a lot of the data is generated by us, by computer programmers, and that data is not necessarily good.
No, absolutely right. So most of the data is generated by us, regular human beings, in the course of living our lives, right? Your smartphone is capturing data about you, and so are the websites and whatnot. And data is this data quality, and getting the data that you need and getting it into the shape that you need is the single biggest problem for machine learning. And in fact, we're going to talk about this a little bit later. If you talk to data scientists, right, people who do this for a living, and ask them where do you spend the most time, this is what they spend the most time on. It's actually not on the fun part of building the models, it's on wrangling the data. In fact, people sometimes talk about the profession of data wrangler, right? A wrangler, used to be someone in a circus who actually, gets the lions to behave, right? And then the lion tamer comes on and does the show. But the wrangler is a very important person, right? Like wrangling data is, 90% of the time and the effort and the cost of doing a machine learning project. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And if the data is garbage, right, then you get garbage in, garbage out. Having said that, and often, usually the bigger the data, the more garbagey it is, right? Data sets of size 100, somebody curated them very carefully and they're very high quality. Data sets of a bazillion different clicks on something, well, who knows what's lurking in there. Having said that, one of the ways in which machine learning has gotten a lot better is that we know actually today how to sift whatever, gold nuggets there are in that vast amount of dirt, right? Which is actually part of what motivates the term data mining. It's like, trying to find the gold in those vast masses of, noisy, useless data. Yeah, so you're totally right.
So recently it was announced that Yahoo would release a curated data set that is of good quality. Has there been any research done on that? Was there a bit?
Yeah. So various of these companies have over time released various data sets, partly because they want to get us, the researchers and and data scientists, to play out with these problems. Partly, I think it's also good publicity and it helps attract people, to maybe actually work for them and whatnot. Companies like Yahoo and Microsoft and of course the most famous one is the Netflix data set. The companies also have to be careful because sometimes it blows up in their face, right? So there's one point at which I think it was Yahoo. They released this data set of web queries and somebody was actually able to identify a particular woman in Massachusetts and the particular health problem that she had from that supposedly anonymized data set. So as much as they do this some of the time, actually they're often also very careful about what they release because first of all, there's often, competitive value, but also, things like this can happen. Yeah, there's a question over here.
I was referring to the previous question that with the Internet of Things, we'll have vast amounts of data from all around the world monitoring almost everything.
Yep. Exactly so. Maybe that's actually one new bullet that I should add. I don't have it here because it hasn't happened yet, but going forward, the next decade, the Internet of Things is going to be one of the biggest applications of machine learning because there's going to be sensors on everything. Your house is going to be full of sensors, but what are they good for? They're good for your house to adapt itself to you automatically. The Nest thermostat, right? It learns to set itself by it's an application of machine learning in the house, but that's just like the tip of the iceberg. And at the same time, so there are two different ways where I think the internet, the machine learning is going to, and the Internet of Things are going to play very well. This is one. The other one is the Internet of Things means that everything is not controllable. But this is a nightmare, right? Think of just all the different things that you can do with Word. Right? You already don't know how to find the things that you want to do. Now imagine if every device had a menu like the Word menu, right? You'd go insane, right? And you had to, make different settings and whatnot. The only way that this is going to work is that the devices learn, and systems are devices, not just individual devices, but systems working together. They have to learn by themselves to choose the settings that you want, or to just give you the half dozen choices that really matter, as opposed to the bazillions of choices that you don't have time or patience for. So yeah, definitely.
What subject areas do you think will drive innovation in machine learning? So particularly things in math, like topology and all this stuff, so like topological data analysis. So I'm wondering, where does advanced math have anything to say about machine learning? Where would you try to dig for new techniques?
Yeah, you know what I tell my students? I tell them that, some students have more of a system building taste, some have more of a math theory taste, and I think there's something in machine learning for both of them. What I tell the math inclined students is that pick your favorite area of math and you will be able to apply it in machine learning, right? If it's topology is actually a real example, right? But I think there's hardly an area of math that hasn't been turned into machine learning algorithms, and those that haven't will soon will be. Because, machine learning is math in action, right? Machine learning is what happens when you add math and data. The fact that you have data makes the math very powerful in ways that it wouldn't be powerful all by itself. And also, we're always in machine learning looking for new ideas of ways to learn, and math is an endless repository of them. So yeah, pick your own favorite area of math and start designing. Maybe you're doing this already, I don't know. Yeah, so there you go. Yeah. There was a question back there. Yeah.
I was just curious. So we're just learning this, right? And in the future, would there be any room for amateurs like us, or just a few years of experience? We wouldn't be counted as real data science, right? How would demand be there? I see that the demand would be great for data scientists, but there is a range of different skills, right?
Absolutely.
Levels. So how would we stack up?
Well, so first of all, there is room for amateurs today, and there will be more in the future for a couple of different reasons. One is, I was just mentioning Kaggle competitions and how most of them are won by amateurs. And this is quite remarkable because often, let's say that, the Kaggle competition is about, drug design, right? It's often won by people who don't know anything about drug design and don't know much about machine learning either. And yet they beat the experts. So in some ways, there has never been more room for amateurs than there is now with machine learning. Because again, the data, replaces your expertise at least to some degree. Now, there are different degrees of expertise in machine learning that you can have, right? And at the top end, there are people who know to do things that are worth, millions of dollars and get paid a lot for doing it. But at the other end of the spectrum, right, there are very simple machine learning algorithms that anybody can learn, and that are already good enough for a huge number of applications, right? The sheer number of low-hanging fruit in the world today of things that machine learning, like when I talk to people who do machine learning, either at startups or at these companies, they always say what's limiting us is not the number of available applications, it's the number of people that we have. So, if you want to design your machine learning algorithms, you need a certain level of knowledge. If you want to use an existing machine learning suite, right, we're not implementing the algorithms, actually you don't need a whole lot of expertise for that. There's a certain amount that you need to know, but it's about the amount that you're going to learn in this class. And also because, there's such a shortage of experts, amateurs will come in to fill that gap, and then will become more expert as they work, and this is what's happening.
Just follow-up question. So you mentioned that there's a lot of available algorithms that you can use, right? So that means the barrier to entry to this, the theory of it is very small. And earlier you also mentioned that 90% of the time people spend the data science jobs wrangling the data. Wouldn't there be this separate kind of field in demand, which is simply dealing with data, which is probably what Kendall compared?
No, there is. So, for example, if you look at the whole field of data science, right, machine learning is only one part of that field. Right, part of the field of data science is, is databases. It's visualization. It's, how to manage data and how to, do it on a large scale and whatnot. And in some sense, machine learning rides on top of all of that. But again, all of these other, there is almost not an area of computer science that is not involved in big data, right? You need the systems, to do them, to run the data centers, right? Because often these things can't just be done on a single server. You need the HCI side. You need, you name it. Yeah. You have a question?
So this is perhaps the fuzz hysteria to me, but it seems like a contradiction because you said at the beginning, almost jokingly, how humans are so predictive. We don't like doing things over and over again, and we don't like to change things.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think that it would be easy to understand and analyze and get to predict humans and learn how people are in a more.
It's not that easy though.
Way.
As much as we are creatures of habits, we are very complex creatures of habits. So, for example, in the beginning, people were trying to predict whether you would like a movie by the attributes of the movie. What type of movie is it? Is it action? Is it drama? Is it comedy? Who's the director? Who are the actors? That turns out to not work that well. The things that make you like or not like a movie are much more subtle. What really works, right, and we're going to study that in this class, is to actually try to find people who are similar to you and generalize from them. Because people are actually extremely complex. So we are predictable on the one hand, but on the other hand, we do need a lot of data and maybe, better algorithms before we can actually predict people accurately. For all the research and engineering that's already gone into it, you look at something like the Amazon recommender system, and it could be a lot better, right? It does all sorts of silly things that it shouldn't. So yeah, there's a long way to go. Other questions? Okay, very good.
So like game theory, and I'm not an expert on that, it kind of went on a downswing and it might come back on an upswing because of machine learning?
Well, game theory and machine learning they followed somewhat different paths in the past. I think there's a very interesting combination of game theory and machine learning that is becoming increasingly important. I already see this in research world, and I think it's going to translate into practice soon, which is the following. People traditionally in machine learning have always assumed that the phenomena that you model won't change. But for example, a very good example of this is spam filtering, right? I can actually build a very accurate spam filter, 99% accurate, but it's not going to be accurate for long because the spammers will change what they do. And they won't change it randomly, right? It's not just, change over time. They are changing deliberately to defeat the spam filter, right? So what we need, and this is actually something that I've done some research on, is a combination of machine learning and game theory where you have a game being played between the machine learning system and the opponents on the other, right? The spammers, the link spam, the clickstream fraud, the fraud detection for banks, like the law enforcement and counterterrorism applications, etc., etc. All of these involve a game between the learning and between the human. And I think, and the way to solve it is with a combination of machine learning and game theory. There are also collaborative games, right? Again, there's another area that people are starting to do research on. Is like you have, for example, a team of robots trying to accomplish a task, right? Rescue people in a disaster area. They need to work together, right? And again, this is game theory. It's not a zero-sum game, but game theory is a good mathematical framework to do this in. But you have to combine it with the machine learning so the robots are getting better and so forth. So pure game theory didn't get very far because it was hard to make it happen in practice. I think when you combine it with a lot of data and with the computational tools that we have today, it will go very far. More questions? Let's see how we're doing on time. Why don't we take a break here? Well, actually, no. Yeah, it's about 8. We're about halfway through. Yeah. Let's take a break here and reconvene in 10 minutes, so at 8:05. Does that sound good? All right.
You made it. Yeah. You guys get like a venue and everything? There you go.
Yeah, sure. Can you send me the link again? I'm not sure if it's yeah, and then I'll try
Не совсем привет. No. I mean, we got the final thing. But not the, well, the second one,
We should ask the Ivan.
I think they did. It's that.
And then there's the beach.
You seen anything, Chuck?
Yeah,
Because they want you to go on vacation. Find out the like grading thing.
I'm going to check for echo in the system, so don't be alarmed.
We're moving to Bellevue. Actually moved to Bellevue. I came back 5 months.
Lucas,
And
right?
then, the verb. But I go to they told me,
I'm also in Bellevue, but in Bonn.
Lambda is more like factorial or
So you can do like manager chain.
The people change.
come for lunch.
In 5 months, I guess
Oh.
it's a good time to. Yeah, I will do that.
Is it open office? Going to be open office? Right now, it's not.
Right now it's not, but I sit with people in like a bigger office.
Okay, okay, okay.
And semi-often. It's actually the worst feeling because you come to your office, and I think they came to someone's office and they talk. You don't, recognize it as a move.
The rest of those Bose noise cancel.
They bought us some crappy music and stuff. Reading the iPhone, run this iPhone. Good.
Yeah, he's reading a paper on train prediction.
Well, I bought myself Bose. They're not that good at filtering the voice, right?
Even prediction.
They're good at filtering background.
Okay, yeah. Wait.
Really horrible. But it's Microsoft who launched, so it's ridiculous and really horrible. We had news articles.
Build
We had the
starting
actual results somewhere.
this
We
week.
actually, so, I mean, our fresh tier had that results in it, but we didn't write it.
Oh, look.
How to
They announced
how to
usually all the things.
predict and discourage become very popular.
Bash, Linux Bash, and Windows stuff.
Oh, really? That already was that
Bunch of old stuff, Exciting things. Usually builds are pretty, like build content is pretty full of announcements. And interesting.
Yeah, I saw that those.
Not so good. But I don't know how they didn't predict this. I mean, this was about to happen, right? I mean,
They said in the public
some
announcement that it was something specific that they didn't design for. And it doesn't clarify what that specifies in this. It sounds like corporate speak. Because there's no like detail of what
because
they draw.
I remember reading something in Microsoft, in Linux, which talked about specifically taking care of these things. So I'm really surprised that this happened.
Yeah, it's all the same, but they actually said that try to make her talk at my level. But maybe it's hard to put it something. When he means like not specifically for this type of attack, he means really hard to put it.
Yeah, apparently it was collaborative. Two individuals did that.
So they're probably prepared for a single, a few people saying things many times. I think.
That I can understand. Learning
Trying to focus on people who don't have a computer science background. Yeah, like you focus on people who are actually like in the sciencey sciences. Biology or astrophysics. Just apply some of the more math than I have from me.
who've taken a step and actually applied it, as opposed to doing the kind of meta analysis that we do ourselves and apply it. Like, they could spin out stuff, right? If you want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, again, the books are good, but they're often very theoretical, right? So they only give you part, and you learning to draw.
So, how's the house going? Do you do your
You have to learn the rules of the road, right?
I'm not gonna get to it. Yeah. Oh, I guess you have an excuse, right? Yeah. For Owens or I thought she was Tri-Cities. Kind of Tri-Cities. Okay, I'm not very.
All right, so let's get going again. I hope that, first part of the lecture kind of motivated you to study machine learning, why it might be important, and the different things that you can do with it. But now let's start looking at what machine learning is, okay? So here's the first thing that you're faced with if you start doing machine learning. In fact, we've already alluded to it, which is that there's an endless quantity and variety of machine learning algorithms out there. There are literally thousands of different machine learning algorithms that you can use, and these days there's hundreds or even thousands more being published every year. So what do? Right? Do you have to learn all of them? If you try to learn all of them, you'll be lost. They come out faster than you can learn them. However, it doesn't have to be that way. The important thing is to realize that for all of their variety, the machine learning algorithms are really just combining the same key elements in different ways. And the important thing to do is to realize what those key elements are. And then you can go about combining them. Right? It's a little bit like the Chipotle menu versus the Chinese restaurant menu. Right? The Chinese restaurant menu goes on for pages and pages and pages because it's the rice this with the chicken that or the shrimp, and you could easily create infinite dishes that way, right? The thing about Chipotle that's clever is that you pick one thing from each column, right? You say, I want the burrito with the carnitas and this salsa, right? So you get on the right side of the combinatorial explosion. Yes, there's a combinatorial explosion of different Mexican dishes that you could have, but if you know the key 5 things and which 10 options you have in each, then you're in much better shape. And it's the same with machine learning, right? So this is the Chipotle theory of machine learning. So what are the key ingredients in a machine learning algorithm? There are 3: representation, evaluation, and optimization. Pretty much every machine learning algorithm that you will ever meet has these 3 components. And now there's many different representations. We'll look at them shortly. Many different ways to do evaluation and many different ways to do optimization. And of course, you can't just combine them randomly. Some go with each, with others more than more with one type or another. But the first step is to know that it's really just these 3 building blocks and the different forms that they can take and how to combine them. So let's start with representation, right? What is representation in a machine learning algorithm? Well, if what a learning algorithm does is output a program, right, the first thing you have to do is choose what the language is that program is going to be written in, right? Now, for human programmers, this might be the choice between, I don't know, Python and Java and C or whatever, right, or COBOL. For machine learning, the choices are things like decision trees is one very popular representation, right? A decision tree, as we're going to see next week, is really just a set of nested if-then-else statements. So it's a very simple programming language, right? If you think of the representations used in machine learning as programming languages, they're often very simple because we want to make it easy for the programs to learn. All those constructs that exist to make life easier for people, right, they're very important for us. But for learning algorithms, they actually only complicate things than they're necessary. So often things are simpler on that side. Another one is sets of rules, and more generally logic programs. So we're going to see here how to induce logic programs from data, right? If you're not familiar with logic programs, we will talk about them in a couple of probably the week after next. Here's the simplest one of all, instances. The very simplest way that you can do machine learning is you just remember what you saw. Right? Instance-based learning is also sometimes called memory-based learning, because all that you do is store the data that you've seen, store all the cases, and then at performance time you do something interesting with them. But the concepts that you've learned are actually just implicitly represented by examples of them. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence from psychology that human beings do a lot of this. So that's another one. Now, another one that we're going to look at is graphical models. This is a very powerful one, and one that is very popular today. And when I talked about the Bayesians dominating, this is what they use. They use things like Bayesian networks and Markov networks. Self-driving cars, what's inside the brain of a self-driving car is a graphical model. Google, right, they use, Google makes money by showing you ads, and they want to predict what is the most profitable ad for you to click on, and then there's an auction based on that. They use the Bayesian network to predict whether or not you're going to click on an ad. And that Bayesian network has, millions of nodes and, I think tens or hundreds of millions of edges between the nodes, so it's huge. So this is another representation that you can use. So this is a graph that is representing the dependencies between variables. Neural networks, we already talked about them. The idea in neural networks is to emulate the brain. Your brain is made of neurons connected together in a very complicated network. And what people do in this representation is they literally create something that at some level is like the brain. It's a network of neurons. And everything that you learn goes into the strengths of the connections between the neurons, which is why that school of machine learning is often called connectionism, because it's all about the connections in the network. Support vector machines, they're actually related to instances, right? Support vectors are really instances that you've selected because they're particularly important. You also have what's called a kernel, which measures the similarity between data points and waits for them. So again, it's not a very complicated representation, but it's quite powerful. And then here's one more to remember, model ensembles. The Netflix prize was won by model ensemble. Most Kaggle competitions are won by model ensembles. A model ensemble is when you don't just take one of these, but you take a whole bunch of them and a whole bunch of variations of them. So for example, I'm not just going to learn one decision tree, I'm going to learn 1,000 decision trees using different parameter settings, different subsets of the data and whatnot, and then I combine them all, right? So model ensemble in some ways is a very complicated representation because it's combining the others, but these days it's one of the things that you definitely want to have. So the choice of language in which you're going to represent what you learn is the first important part of a learning algorithm. The second one is evaluation. So let's say that I pick, decision trees, right, as my language. Now what I'm looking for is in the space of all the possible decision trees, what is the best one to model the phenomena that I'm interested in? What is the best decision tree for deciding who's a good credit risk or not? What is the best decision tree for deciding whether this person has diabetes or not? Okay? In order to do that, we need to evaluate each candidate tree or each candidate program to decide how good it is. So we need a way to score our models, and there's many different ways. The most widely used one is just accuracy. If I go and diagnose 1,000 patients using my decision tree, if the decision tree gets 700 of them right, then my accuracy is 70%. And of course, what I want to do is maximize the accuracy, hopefully get to 100%, but most of the time you can't get to 100%. Okay? So that's accuracy. Two other very popular ones are precision and recall. In information retrieval and things like web search, this is often what people use. Precision and recall are the following thing. The precision is out of the yeses that I return, for example, I say, oh, this document is relevant. What fraction of them really are relevant, right? So if your precision is high, every result that you get is good. But that only captures part of the truth. The other part is recall. Recall is out of all the things that were good, how many did you find, right? If I just return to you one page that happens to be relevant, then the precision is 100%, but the recall is terrible because maybe there were a lot of million pages out there that I didn't return. Okay? So in many areas, precision and recall are a better thing to use than accuracy. Typically, when you have a lot of trivial true negatives, most documents are not interesting and you're not going to return them, accuracy would just get very high if I labeled, like you issue a query on the web, right? I label every document as not relevant, right? My accuracy will probably be 99.9999%, and it'll be completely meaningless because I'm not returning anything. For things like that, precision and recall are better. If what you're doing is predicting a continuous variable, like for example, how much are you going to spend if I send you my catalog, another early application of machine learning, or how much is this thing going to be worth tomorrow, then you need a continuous measure of error. And the one that is most often used is squared error. It's just the difference between what you predicted and the truth squared. So I said, if I send you this catalog, you will order $500 worth of merchandise from it, but you wind up ordering 700, then I was off by 200, and the square of that is 40,000. Okay? So squared error is a very popular measure. It's what traditionally statisticians used when they do regression, right? So statisticians, for the most part, have focused on predicting continuous variables, and squared error is the single, most frequent measure that they use. Likelihood is something that you use when you're predicting probabilities. So likelihood is how likely the data is given your model. So when you're learning a probabilistic model, the simplest way to learn it is by maximizing likelihood, which is I want to learn the model that makes the data that I'm seeing as likely as possible. The reasoning behind that is that if I'm saying that this data is very probable, that makes me probable. If I have a model of the world that makes the data that I'm actually getting very improbable, then it's probably a bad model. So the data being improbable according to the model makes the model be improbable according to the data, and that's what we call the likelihood. Is the probability of the data according to the model, but viewed as a function of the model. And this is what we're going to use when learning things like graphical models, for example. All of these measures, however, they're easy to write algorithms for, and in fact, most of the algorithms that you will see in textbooks use measures like this. They tend not to be what you really care about at the end of the day. At the end of the day, when you deploy a machine learning system, there's actually some real measure of utility that you care about. Like, for example, how much will your errors cost? Or how much money, for example, will you make if you're Google when people click on an ad or don't click? Or when they click on an ad that gets them $10 versus an ad that gets them a penny. Okay? And there, what you can do is actually use a measure of cost, or more generally of utility, to evaluate the learning. So for example, if you have a spam filter, accuracy is not a good measure, because again, it's very easy to get high accuracy just by labeling everything as spam. Right? The majority of email is spam. However, then you won't get any email anymore. That's not good. Right? The difference is that labeling a spam email as good, just costs, a fraction of a second of wasted attention. Labeling a good email as spam, right? Your boss just sent you an email saying, I need this by tomorrow or you're fired, right? You label that as spam and you lose your job. So the costs are very asymmetric, right? So your utility function is actually not the same as accuracy. Well, we can actually have algorithms that explicitly and deliberately optimize the utility, wherever it might be, whether it's your happiness or the return on investment of a company. You can have algorithms that directly maximize that. Then here's another one that's kind of interesting. This is what support vector machines and kernel machines use. This is margin. This is also for things like making discrete predictions, right? This person has this. For example, I'm looking at this X-ray. There is lung cancer in this X-ray versus there isn't. But now what I can try to do in addition to asking whether I make the right prediction or not is how far was I from making the right prediction, right? If you think of a boundary between, yes, cancer on this side and no cancer on that side, right? But you also want to ask yourself, how close to the boundary are you? Ideally, you want to make a prediction that is very safe, meaning it's well within the positive area. You want to maximize your margin of safety. And this is what support vector machines do. Okay, so another very important measure. And then there's things like, for example, entropy. Right? One of the ways in which we'll see that models can be learned is using these measures from information theory, like entropy and KL divergence. Entropy is basically how much chaos you're seeing in the data. Right? The whole point of learning a model, the whole point of our brains, right, is to bring order to the chaos. Right? Is to take what seemed to be random and make it now follow some kind of logic. And you can explicitly measure the entropy of the data after you've learned your model and try to minimize it. So you're trying to make the world more ordered, and we have measures of that and we can use them. KL divergence is also known as the relative entropy. It's a measure of how much two probability distributions differ from each other. Okay? In particular, likelihood is actually just the KL divergence between your distribution and the data distribution. But you could also be trying to optimize the difference between two distributions that aren't just the data in your model, but maybe your model and the distribution that you believe in a priori is true, And you want to stay close to that distribution while modeling the data well. Okay? And every day, people come up with new measures. Right? So this is just a small sample of them, but it's not a random sample. These are the most important and the most widely used ones. You definitely want to be aware of them. And now you can see how you can start to combine these different representations with these different evaluations to produce different learning algorithms. Okay? But now, of course, there's one very important part still missing, which is optimization. Once I've chosen a representation and once I've chosen an evaluation measure, now there's the search process by which I optimize that measure. How do I find the most accurate decision tree? Well, naively, I could try all possible decision trees, brute force, but there's more decision trees than there are atoms in the universe, so that's not going to work. So now what I want to do is what's called optimization. Or in AI, it's often called search. Right? And there's three main types of optimization. If you're looking at discrete models, like for example, decision trees that are in essence a type of graph with with discrete parts, then you use what is called combinatorial optimization. And the simplest type of combinatorial optimization is just greedy search. It's like I try a bunch of things, I pick the best one, and then I start with that one, and I try a bunch of variations, I pick the best one, and I just keep on doing that. We call it greedy search because it's being greedy. It just it just goes for the single biggest gain that it can get right away, irrespective of what might happen in the long term. If you're trying to optimize continuous parameters, like for example in a neural network, right? As I said, the knowledge that is learned is contained in the weights, in how strong the connections are between the neurons. These are real values. Okay? To do that, what we use is what's called continuous or in a slight misnomer, convex optimization. And the most popular form of that, and this is used all over the place today, right? Google spends a lot of cycles doing this. For example, is gradient descent. Right? Gradient descent is a way to optimize, the parameters of a continuous function in order to maximize it or minimize it. Let's say, for example, we're trying to minimize the square there. Well, what we do in gradient descent is find, using calculus, the values of the weights that minimize the error. Okay? And then finally, there's constrained optimization, which is really in some ways a combination of combinatorial and convex optimization. This is what you use when you're trying to optimize a continuous function, but within constraints. And the quintessential example of that is linear programming. Right? So you have a linear function that you're trying to maximize. So for example, the number of widgets that your factory produces, or the money that you make selling them, but subject to certain constraints. Like for example, this machine can only do so many things an hour, and you only have this many raw materials, and so on and so forth. Okay? Support vector machines are an example of constrained optimization. As we'll see, they have they are trying to minimize, or think about it this way: they are trying to maximize, the margin of all the training examples. Okay, so constrained optimization is actually the most recent of these methods. So combinatorial and continuous optimization have been used in machine learning, for decades. It started in machine learning with support vector machines, but now it's used for a lot of other things as well. Okay? So again, I'm not going to assume that you know these things in class. If you know them, it's good. Reviewing them is useful as well. Constrained optimization in particular, I will do a sort of like a little constrained optimization 101 because it's something that I assume that most people aren't familiar with. Okay. And now now you can see how machine learning algorithms work, right? You pick a representation, and then you pick an evaluation measure, and then you pick an optimization method. You may pick existing ones, or what machine learning researchers do for a living is come up with new representations, which doesn't happen very often, or come up with new evaluation measures for existing representations, which happens more often, or what happens most often is they come up with new special optimization methods that are specifically designed for the particular representation and evaluation measure that they chose. Okay? So in a way, designing a new machine learning algorithm is a very, it's an art of given the problem that you're trying to solve, how do I represent my solution to that problem? That is the first and biggest question. And then what is the measure that I should use, right, to decide how well I'm doing? Because if I pick the wrong measure, then having a good representation isn't going to save me. And then how can I optimize it in a way that is feasible within the computational resources that I have. Okay? Questions about this? Okay, very good. So remember, now you have a map of machine learning, right? Whenever you see a new learning algorithm, you can go back at these three categories and see, well, where does it fall within each one of these? And so it's not this big jungle anymore. It actually has some order to it. Okay, now, there is more than one type of machine learning. We're actually not going to cover them all in this class because there's no time. But let me just tell you what the main ones are. Because you definitely want to be aware of them because they might be what you need for the application that you have in mind. By far, the single most widely used type of machine learning, if you pick a random industry, a random company, a random area of science, this is what they're most likely to be using, is what is called supervised learning, also known as inductive learning. This is learning when you have a teacher. That's why it's supervised, because somebody's supervising you. That little diagram that I drew of the computer and the data and the output go in, and out comes the algorithm, that's actually supervised learning. It's when somebody has told you what the right answer is. Somebody labeled the emails as being spam or not spam. Somebody labeled the x-rays as being cancer or not cancer. So you know what you need to learn, right? There's a teacher telling you the right answer. You predict that the stock would go up, and then it either went up or didn't. Okay? Supervised learning is the most mature type of learning. It's the most widely studied. As I said, it's also the most widely used in practice. It's therefore the one that we're going to spend most of this class on. Okay? Because both in terms of the key concepts and in terms of your likelihood of using it, it's the most important one. But there's others. Towards the end of the class, we will look a little bit at unsupervised learning. Much harder, but in the long run, the most important one. Right? Unsupervised learning is what babies do when they start crawling around and putting things in their mouth. Right? They may look like they're playing, but actually they're learning very important things that their parents can teach them. Right? When a parent says, "Oh, that's a chair and that's a table," that's supervised learning. Right? When a baby figures out how to walk, that's unsupervised learning. And that is an amazing kind of learning, right? The fact that a baby, a 2-year-old can pick up an object and manipulate it, we don't have learning algorithms that can do that today. In practice, right, we have a lot more unsupervised data than we have supervised data, right? Because often labeling data costs money. Sometimes you get it for free and then this is a great application, but sometimes it costs money. Often it's worth the money. But if we can learn from unsupervised data, we can learn, orders of magnitude more things than otherwise. It's just a much harder problem, right? It's a harder problem even to the point that it's not even clear what the evaluation measure really should be, right? When you have a teacher and you have a test, right, there's the number of questions that you got right. That's supervised learning. Well, you got these 70, emails correct and those 31s wrong. When you're doing unsupervised learning, it's not even clear how do you decide whether you're doing well. But again, this is, after supervised learning, this is the second oldest and most studied subfield of machine learning. And there are a lot of interesting things to do there as well. And we'll look at some of them. There's also different combinations of the two that you can do. So for example, something that is becoming very popular is there's this semi-supervised learning, where what happens is that for some of the examples you have labels, but for most of them you don't. And it often turns out to be the case that a little bit of supervision goes a long way. So if I have 10,000 labeled examples and 10 million unlabeled ones, I can probably do a lot better than if I just had the 10,000 labeled ones. Okay? And there are a lot of techniques for doing these things. It's an active research area. It's fairly young. We're not going to touch on it in this class, but I just want you to be aware that it exists. And then finally, there's reinforcement learning, which is in some ways the most ambitious type of learning and what is closest to how human beings learn. It's actually originally inspired by psychology. Reinforcement learning is when you're an agent in the world, you're going around doing things, and nobody's telling you what the right and wrong answer is, or usually they aren't, but every now and then you get a reward, right? Imagine our ancestors, right? Sometimes they got something to eat, sometimes they didn't, right? Sometimes they picked up a mushroom that was good, sometimes, they picked up a mushroom that poisoned them. Right? Sometimes they decided to run away from the tiger and that was a good call. Sometimes they didn't and that was the good call. Okay? So, human beings do reinforcement learning. People who want to solve AI, to build, robots that really can do everything that humans can, they really do a lot of reinforcement learning. In some ways, in practice, in industry, it's the least widely used, the least mature type of learning. However, it does have one very prominent recent success. You know what it is? AlphaGo, right? AlphaGo is a reinforcement learning program that just, killed that darn human, right? AlphaGo is actually not a success of machines versus humans. It's the success of us, computer scientists versus them Go players, right? If you talk to AI types, right, when they celebrated when AlphaGo was winning, right? The people in the press conference, right, when Lee Sedol finally won a game, right, he said he had never gotten a bigger ovation than that time, right? Because the journalists wanted the human to win, but we know better, right? My first AI project in grad school was actually to build a Go player. And I was very happy when I played my system. Because if I won, that made me happy because I had won the game. When the program won, I was happy because that meant I had built a good Go program. So I felt happy either as a player or as a programmer. So for us, it's a win-win. But DeepMind, right? It's the company that built, AlphaGo. They've also, for example, you probably know this, they have a program, right, that learns to play Atari games better than humans. It learns to play, Space Invaders and Pong and things like that, while knowing nothing whatsoever about the game to start with, right? It's the same reinforcement learning program with a neural network inside, so it's a combination of reinforcement learning with deep learning, right? Reinforcement learning often has supervised learning inside it. Right? Once you know the rewards, then you try to learn based on them. So this is what they use as reinforcement learning. So, and my guess, nobody has said this officially, but I'm pretty confident that Google has actually started to use reinforcement learning for their web searches, and Bing is probably also doing the same. So maybe reinforcement learning is already more more successful in practice than people take for granted. Certainly, I think going forward in one form or another, it's going to play a very big role in self-driving cars, in home robots, in who knows what. Okay? We're not going to cover it here because there isn't time for everything, but there is a chapter in Mitchell about reinforcement learning, and if you're curious, I encourage you to read it. Yeah?
What's the difference between reinforcement learning and unsupervised learning?
Yeah, so in unsupervised learning, you get no feedback whatsoever, right? So in a way, you could think of reinforcement learning as a type of slightly supervised learning. So for example, in unsupervised learning, you do things like clustering, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a company, can I cluster my customers into what they call segments, right? Mm-hmm. I'm Nike, I sell shoes. It turns out that my biggest customers are teenage boys on the one hand and middle-aged women on the other, right? You don't want to do the same marketing campaign for both of them, because what appeals to one of them will probably, repulse the other. So, but that's clustering, right? Nobody tells you in advance what the cluster is going to be. In reinforcement learning, what happens is you get a reward every now and then. Like, for example, in the case of game playing, right, quintessential application. When you play a game of Go and you make a move, you have no idea really if that move is going to be good or bad. I mean the computer, right? You don't know anything yet, right? You just started to play Go. How do you know if a move is good or bad, right? Supervised learning would be somebody tells you, this is a good move, make it. Or no, bad move, don't make it. What you get is at the end of the game, you get the signal, which is you won or you lost. That's your reward. And now what reinforcement learning does is it propagates that signal all the way from the end of the game back to the moves that you're making. It's like, oh, I made this move, and over the many games that I've played with myself, right? So AlphaGo plays games with itself, which is actually one of the oldest ideas in machine learning. I can figure out that, like, yes, this move tends to lead to good outcomes, right? So reinforcement learning is all about backing up these rewards, right? Let me give you another example that perhaps is even better. How do you do reinforcement learning? You know what happens when you touch a stove, a hot stove, right? It's like you immediately move your hand away, right? This is actually a reflex. That's not reinforcement learning. What is reinforcement learning? And again, there's a lot of neurological evidence that human beings do. They are running reinforcement learning algorithms in their brain. Is that I learn to predict that if I move my hand like this, it will touch the stove. And I almost feel the pain of touching the stove before I even touch it. Now, this is what reinforcement learning is like. I can predict my rewards or punishments, right? The pain and pleasure, right? Reinforcement learning is about pain and pleasure and knowing in advance the things that are going to lead to pain or pleasure down the line. So yeah, it's a hard problem, but it's a very important one. Yeah. More questions? So these are the major types of learning. Now let's focus on inductive learning because, as I said, it is the most important one and what most of this class will focus on. So inductive problem can be defined very crisply in the following way. What you're given is examples of a function. So the examples come in the form of pairs x, where x is your input, and typically in machine learning your input is a vector of values that could be continuous or discrete or a mix of them. But in general your x could be anything. It could be a graph, it could be a tree, it could be a matrix, it could be, you name it, right? But typically it's a vector of values, and that's what we're going to be dealing with. So that's the first element of the pair. The second one is the value of the function for that element. Okay? So, for example, this is the symptoms of a patient, X, right? The test results. This was her temperature, this was her blood pressure, this was the blood glucose level, etc., etc. And the f of x is the diagnosis. Yes, she did have diabetes, or no, she didn't have diabetes. Or yes, this is, this is a good credit risk, or no, this is a good credit risk, and so on and so forth, right? So this is what you have to work with, is a database, if you will, of these examples, the x and the f of x. And your goal is to predict the function f of x for new examples. This is the crux of inductive learning. It's that you want to predict for examples that you haven't seen what the value of the function on them is going to be. Tomorrow, a new patient comes into my office. I've never seen that patient. I've never seen his particular combination of symptoms. But I still want to predict whether he has diabetes or the flu or whatever it might be. So the test of inductive learning is how well you generalize to new examples. How well you do on the examples that were in the training data, well, that doesn't matter because you can just remember them, right? And then you will always give the right answer. That part is just an information retrieval problem, okay? So the goal is to predict, right? Inductive learning is all about prediction, and the question is how accurate will your predictions be? And now, of course, this can take different forms depending on the thing that you're predicting. If the thing that you're predicting is discrete, then we call it classification. So, for example, I have a computer vision system, and I want to label the objects that I'm seeing. I say like, oh, this is a chair, or no, this is a table, or this is a door, right? So I'm predicting the class of the objects, which is why we call this classification. Okay, but spam and non-spam, those are two classes, and that's also a classification problem. Okay, if what you're trying to predict is continuous, as I already mentioned, then we call it regression. Right? This is a slightly unfortunate term that comes from statistics. The historical reasons for this are not important. But regression is really just a problem of predicting a continuous variable, right? Can I predict what the gas mileage of this car will be, depending on, the various characteristics of the car, right? That's a regression problem. And finally, if what I'm predicting is a probability, right? I'm Google. If I put this ad in front of you, next to this, a page of results, what is the probability that you will click on it? Okay? Now we call this probability estimation. Okay? Often what we're predicting is not just a probability of one thing, but a probability of several things at the same time. Okay? But that is still called probability estimation. It's just a harder version. Okay? So inductive learning, depending on what you're predicting, has different versions to it. For the most part in this class, we're going to focus on classification. Because again, in terms of the applications out there today, this is the most, the most widespread one. But we'll also touch on regression and probability estimation occasionally. And a lot of the ideas that we will touch on are common to all of them. And one of the themes of this class is that the goal here is not just to learn particular algorithms, but to learn the concepts that you need to work with any algorithm, present or future, or designed for you for a particular application. The easy, quick way to do machine learning is to take an off-the-shelf algorithm and apply it to the problem. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But at the end of the day, the really deep solution, the professional solution is you design a new learning algorithm for that problem. And part of what you should learn in this class is how to do that, using concepts that really cut across all of the different types of learning. Things like overfitting and the curse of dimensionality and how to deal with them. And, and we will see these things as we go along. Questions? Okay, very good. So, here's what we'll cover in the class, right? So here's what's going to happen in the next 9.5 weeks of this class. We're going to talk, as I said, mostly about supervised learning, and we're going to organize things mainly by representation. Again, this is what all the textbooks do. So we're going to start by looking at decision tree induction, and then rule induction. These are what's called symbolic learning, right? So this is what I call the symbolists in the master algorithm. Then we will look at instance-based learning, also known as similarity-based or memory-based or analogy-based learning. These are the analogizers. Then we will look at Bayesian learning, which, as the name implies, is what Bayesians do. And we learn things like Bayesian networks, Markov networks, probabilistic models, and then neural networks, which again these days are known more as deep learning, but really deep learning is just one type of neural network, and we will see the algorithm that powers deep learning. It's called backprop, and it's the main thing that we will look at here, or backpropagation to give it the full name. We will look at support vector machines, which are really another kind of instance-based learning, but also has some aspects of neural networks. And then model ensembles, right? Once we've learned all these individual classes of machine learning, we will learn a very easy trick that is incredibly powerful, which is once you've taken all this time and effort to apply these different things to your problem and try to get one of them to work well, it's an easy way to actually just combine them all into one bigger model. And we'll see how to do that. And finally, we will look at learning theory. Learning theory is a theory of how to do things like avoid overfitting and deal with the curse of dimensionality. And if you're not learning what you should, trying to diagnose what the problem is and how to fix it. Do I need more data? Do I need more attributes for each object, or do I need more objects? So there is a theory of how to do these things, and we're going to look at it, and at that point, you'll probably be very motivated to look at this because you will see these issues recurring and you'll be wondering, well, is there a more general solution to them? And the answer is yes. People often start machine learning class with the theory. I don't think that's a very good choice because in the beginning, the theory sounds maybe very dry and not very useful. I think after we've seen all the rest, the theory will be much, much more interesting. And again, there's a huge literature on learning theory. We're going to focus on the more useful parts of that theory. Okay, so that'll be an interesting set of concepts to have. And then finally, we will look at unsupervised learning. The two main forms of unsupervised learning are clustering and dimensionality reduction. We will look at both of these. If you think of data as being a big table, here are all the people who go to your website. Each line is a person and all their clicks, and maybe the registration form that they filled out if they did, or demographic data that you've acquired about them. So this is one person is one row in your data. It could be very long these days, right? Every click is one Boolean element in that X vector, and then you have as many rows as there are people, right? So each column is one attribute, one variable. Each row is one person, or in general one entity. Clustering is about reducing the number of rows. So trying to cluster, for example, your people into segments, like for example in the marketing example that I gave. Dimensionality reduction is about trying to reduce the number of columns. Yes, I have these people described by 100,000 things, but I can't look at them. Can I reduce this to 10 things, or maybe even to 2 or 3 that I can visually look at? Okay, so dimensionality reduction and the clustering are in some sense complementary because they make the data more manageable in different ways. Okay? Questions? Okay, so before we get started on inductive learning, here's a very important slide. Maybe the most important one of this entire lecture. Machine learning in practice is often very different from the machine learning that you learn in class. And there's a reason for that, but you have to remember what it really is like in practice because you're hopefully going to be doing it in practice. the stuff that we're going to learn here is really only the middle part of doing machine learning. And we already alluded to the fact that, for example, dealing with the data is an important problem that takes up a lot of your time. So let's look at a more complete picture of what the machine learning life cycle is. And when you're a data scientist, you're continuously going through this cycle. And it's important to realize what all the parts are. The reason we're only going to focus on the middle part, which is building the model, is that this is the one that we know how to do in general. This is the one that's very mature. And also because of that, it's the one that we can do quickly. But it's important to remember that this is embedded in a larger process. And if that larger process fails, then the machine learning fails. Okay? So what is that process? The first part, right? Somebody comes to you with a machine learning problem. It could be your boss. It could be some company that wants to use you as a data scientist. And sometimes they know very well what the problem is that they want to solve. Sometimes they have no idea. They just go like, we have all of this data, and our competitors have all this data, and I know that there's value in the data, and they're getting ahead of us, so please do something with it, right? And then you have to figure out what to do with it that will bring value to the company. This is not, I mean, I'm only exaggerating slightly. Sometimes it's like, there is this quantity that we want to predict, and here's what the evaluation function is, and here's the data, like, now do this, right? Either way, the first step is that you need to understand the problem. As we're going to see shortly, the data on its own doesn't let you generalize. You need some more assumptions, some more knowledge. And the more you understand about the problem and the domain, the better off you are. So there's no replacement at the end of the day for talking with the people who know the problem somewhat, talking with the experts, figuring out what machine learning can do, what is the best way to formulate the problem as a classification problem or a clustering problem or whatever it might be. So this involves understanding some of the prior knowledge in the domain, right? People often in these domains, whether they're doctors or marketers or whatever, they have a lot of knowledge. Some of it might be wrong, it might be complete, it might be oversimplified relative to what the data can give you, but it's often a very good starting point, okay? And you also need to understand what the goals of the learning are, right? What are you or what are your customers or your boss trying to get out of the learning, right? You need to design a learning algorithm or a combination of learning techniques that will achieve that goal, or that will optimize, whatever that evaluation function is. So you need to understand what that is. In some cases, it's straightforward. In some cases, it's not very straightforward at all. But this is definitely where things begin. And then the second part that we've already alluded to is getting the data to do this. Figuring out what is that you need, where you can find it, bringing it all together, cleaning it up, right? Data's full of crap. It's full of wrong values. Everybody was born on January 1st, 1911. You know why? Because the form had birth date and people just, go 1, 1, 1, 1. This is a real example, right? The clickstream data set that I just mentioned that we're going to be using in one of the projects, this was one of the problems there. Like there was this huge spike of people born on January 1st, 1911. Another problem was that everybody seemed to have been born on even years. You know why? Because the data had been in pairs of years, right? Right. Another problem is things like, well, here's a male and here's his pregnancy, right? I mean, data is data. Data is not the real world, right? So there's lots of stuff like that. And you have to clean up the data. You have to integrate it. You would be surprised, even for companies that are natively, data-rich IT companies, that they are online businesses. You can see why the data might be a problem if you have an offline business, like a retail store, right? And now you have to record things, and that can be costly in MS. But even for companies that are online companies, like e-commerce sites, you'd be surprised how much, there's what's called the data stovepipe over here, and another data stovepipe over there. And it's far from trivial to actually get that data and put it in a form that you want, right? But that is a very important and typically the most time-consuming part of this whole process. Then finally comes the fun part, and the one that everybody enjoys, and that we're going to spend most of this class on, which is actually learning the models. You have the data, and now you're going to run machine learning algorithms on it. You're going to try different variations. You're going to use your gut feeling, your black magic, your intuition, your expertise to come up with the best model that you can. Supposing that, and now what happens is that, the algorithms run, they produce an output. The first thing that you need to do is interpret the results, understand what they're producing. Is it correct? Is it incorrect? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it as accurate as you need it to be? Is it surprising? Is it wrong? Or were the experts wrong, right? What often happens is that the learning says one thing and the experts say another, and then, depending on the company, one or the other might win, or depending on the people, but you're going to have to explain to others and also to yourself, what the results are, partly so they'll accept it, but also partly so that you're able to correct what's going wrong or provide what's missing and go one more round where you will then get better results. So again, interpreting results is not something that, it's not something that you can learn, like we're going to have one lecture in this class about how to interpret results. It's a lot more subtle than that. And partly it's only learned by experience, but it's a very important part. And then finally, there's actually what is usually the single biggest point of failure in machine learning projects, which is everything went great, but at the end of the day, it's not deployed. At the end of the day, the company winds up not using that learned model, or your customer doesn't, maybe they still pay you, but they don't use the models that you came up with, okay? Which is, of course, often very frustrating. Sometimes it's because they want to understand why the system is doing what it's doing. So, for example, you can't just tell someone, you need surgery today. And they ask why, and say, well, I have a neural network here that is, trust me, it's really accurate. It just says you need surgery. Go on, right? And people will say, no, sorry, we won't take that. So, one disadvantage of deep learning is that nobody understands what's going on inside. And often these days people saying like, oh, the problem with machine learning is that nobody understands it. This is not true. There are other types of machine learning, like, for example, decision trees and set of rules that are much more understandable. So this is one thing to bear in mind. But it goes beyond that. It may be that, or it usually is that, to deploy a machine learning system or to deploy a learned model, this goes into a particular product or a particular online process or a particular organization where people may be open to it or may resist it. They may be for the machine learning, they may be against it. It may be the case that the learning, does what they want, or maybe it doesn't. A very famous example of this is Google. Google is probably the biggest user of machine learning in the world. We use machine learning for everything, for example, for ad placement, but ironically, using it for search was actually something that lagged behind. Because the information retrieval people, the data said, look, this is more accurate. But the information retrieval folks said, like, no, we don't trust it. This is the crown jewels. We don't want to run the risk of it making the wrong decision, right? Which maybe is legitimate. These days, actually, things like deep learning, we're at the point where the learning finally is replacing these more hand-coded solutions. But oftentimes it won't happen because the people who are doing the learning neglected the downstream process that it was going to go into. And then finally, this thing is not just a one-shot progression. It's more like a loop. You loop between these two things, and then you loop between these two, and you loop between these three and these four. So there's loops within loops, right? Even after you've successfully deployed something, it'll probably work fine for 6 months or a year, and then you'll need to go back and do it. In fact, these days, increasingly, people are doing what's called online learning, which is the system is learning all the time. You're continuously adjusting it at the same time that it's actually performing whatever it's supposed to do in practice, okay? So this is a cycle. It's not a sequence of things. And everything that we're going to learn in this class, you have to remember, it goes into this cycle. And you have to be cognizant of this cycle and in control of it if you want your machine learning to be successful, okay? And again, you should remember that if you decide to do a great machine learning startup, because it's going to be a lot of fun and you're going to make a lot of money, remember, you're probably going to spend, 10% of your time doing this and 90% of your time doing this, okay? And, or 90% of the time doing the rest of it. So remember that, okay? And that in itself has its own rewards and challenges and its own black art and uses for your, expertise and intuition and so on, okay? Questions?
So this piece of data preprocessing and integration, is there in general tools that people use to perform these tasks, or is it some manual things of black art like you're saying?
Yes, so there are tools, but unfortunately the state of the tools is very poor. These days you can buy, these, data analysis suites that, companies like IBM and Oracle and SAS and all will sell you. And they have tools to do that integration and to say, like, I want to use this, I want to compute this value from those and use that, I want to take this out. So you can do a lot of these things. So, and that's all well and good. However, and ironically, it winds up being that most of the time, most of your work is not done in those tools because you want to do something that they didn't provide. Or the problem is you have to go get some data source somewhere and do a bunch of things to it before it's even at the point where you can use those tools. And so what usually winds up happening is that what you have is at the end of a machine learning project is a huge bunch of Perl scripts, right? That do this data munging and then that data munging, or take your own favorite language, but I didn't pick Perl by accident, and then you forget them and go on to the next project and do the next set of little scripts, which is obviously a very primitive way to do things. But the reason things are that way, it's very hard to say a priori what are the features that you want to compute and the things that you want to create. So oftentimes there's no choice but to do things on the fly. It's kind of like one case at a time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about there's lots of services such as in Azure and in Amazon for
Mm-hmm.
machine learning where you actually just bring your data,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, and select whatever one of those three things, and then off comes a model, and that's just getting so much easier. It seems like the process of coming up with a machine learning model and outputs and just doing this iterative process is becoming so simplified.
Yeah.
They use the term of democratize, right? It's just like
Yeah.
everybody can do this. What's your take
So
on
these things are definitely a big step in the right direction, right? And I think again, Microsoft and Amazon are probably the leading providers of this at this point in somewhat different styles. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, right, these things do not at this point make expertise unnecessary. What we would like to have, and hopefully will at some point, is intelligence on tap, right? It's like the same way that you can have electricity on tap or computing on tap in the cloud, you have intelligence on tap, right? This thing comes in and looks at your data, or you provide it your data, and then figures out all these smart things to do, on its own, right? It does the job of the data scientist, and you can just stand back and enjoy the results. Right now, we're still very far from that. You can do your machine learning on the cloud, whether it's Microsoft's or Amazon's or Google's or IBM's or anybody else's, but part of the selling point that they have is, you don't have enough data scientists for all the things that you want to do, right? Or you have people who maybe understand things only at a certain level, they don't have a PhD in machine learning. Well, we'll do it all for you on the cloud, right? And we'll see how this all plays out, but I think to a large extent that is still not possible yet. They are, making a big effort to make this all as automated as possible, but at the end of the day, it still takes some amount of human expertise and machine learning knowledge, and more generally, data science knowledge to do these things. So in some ways, the sort of like, these APIs, right, the on the cloud machine learning is a natural evolution from the suites of machine learning tools that I was just talking about. Like in the beginning, people had like nothing. Then they had like, you had to program everything yourself. Then there would be like sort of like these single algorithm implementations. Then came the suites, right? And then the same way that everything became cloud provided, now machine learning is becoming cloud provided. But it's actually much harder to make machine learning be cloud provided than to provide things that are much more, easy to tame, right? Things that are more, sort of like regular programming is much easier to provide on the cloud than machine learning. But definitely, there's so much value in doing it on the cloud that this is where things are
Yeah, I was speaking from, I know that, I think it's Azure Data Service, for example, you have APIs. As a developer, you can write programs that consume churn predictor APIs, as an example. And there are just tons of them available there.
Yeah.
There's just a huge wealth of APIs you can just connect and
Exactly. So in addition to particular, algorithms, right, you also have and are going to have more and more what are called verticals, right, which is things developed for a particular application, like say churn prediction or fraud detection or you name it. But here's the thing. So there's the API, right? So what are you going to use? Which churn prediction algorithm are you going to use? How? It has many parameters. How are you going to set them? Maybe there's something else that you should be using, right? You're not at the point where you can say, oh, I'm Bank of America. I want to predict trend from my customers. Push the button, and Microsoft just did that for me.
provide data, good quality
Yeah,
data. Yeah.
exactly. So this is a good thing, but it's not at the point where you
not
can
the-
just
yeah,
push the button and
nascent.
yeah. Also, they vary in how far along they are, right? And again, if we talk again in 2 years' time, the machine learning cloud offerings and the APIs will be better. They'll do more things. There's also a lot of work going on, like how can you have what's called meta learning about learning, algorithms that will do some of the machine learning selection for you. So that I think is going to come online more as well. We'll look a little bit at some of that here, but yeah, things are moving very fast in this space. So yeah. More questions? Okay, very good. So that was our general intro to machine learning. So now let's look at inductive learning. Okay, and again, before we start looking at decision trees, which we will do next week, we will first look at some general concepts of inductive learning, and these are actually very important because again, they're going to apply not just to decision trees, but all the things that we're going to see. We're going to start with them today. We have 20 minutes, which is good enough for a lot of things. And then we will finish them next week and start talking about decision trees. Okay? All right. So, to recap, what you're given, so this is the input and the output, right? The input are training examples where you have your vector of values x and your function value f for some function that you don't know. And the problem is to figure out what that function is from those examples, right? You want to find as good an approximation to this function as you can, okay? But now this is a really, really general statement of the problem, right? It encompasses almost anything, right? Every program is a function. So in practice, what do people use inductive learning for, right? What is it good for? What are some of the good applications and what are the more general characteristics that they have, right? So let's look at both some examples and know what the more general picture, behind those examples is. So here's some examples that we've already alluded to. One of them is assessing credit risk, right? What is the X in this case? The X in this case is the properties of the customer and often also the properties of the proposed purchase, right? Well, here's your resources and here's the mortgage that you're asking for. No, you're trying to buy a house that's too expensive for you, okay? Or like here's, for example, the number of years at your current job, the number of your annual income, right? The number of years at your current residence. These are the things that they actually use, to score people for credit. Here's another one: diagnosing disease, right? Here, what you have are the properties of the patient, the test results, the symptoms, and the goal is the diagnosis and perhaps also the therapy. What is the drug that you should take? Right? This is what doctors spend years in med school to do, and what shockingly, a machine learning algorithm can learn in 10 seconds to do better than they do. You can give, a very simple machine learning algorithm a database of, 1,000 patient records, and it learns to diagnose one of these things better than a human doctor. Shocking but true. Not universally true, but true in many applications, in many types of diagnosis. And there are these systems like, for example, Bayesian networks that will diagnose, thousands of different diseases at the same time from tens of thousands of possible different symptoms. Some of the people who have developed them are at Microsoft Research. Face recognition, another quintessential machine learning application, very popular these days because of things like Facebook, but also going back many decades. So here the input is actually the bitmap. It's the pixels, right? Think of how hard this problem is, right? I just gave you the gray levels on these pixels, and I want you to tell me what's in the picture. This is an extraordinarily difficult problem. And again, nobody knows how to program, an assistant to, say, detect a cat in a picture or your grandmother, okay? So the output here, for example, might be the name of the person. The input is the face of the person, the output is the name of the person. So Facebook says like, oh, this is your friend Alice, or oh, this is your friend Bob. Or, the NSA says like, oh, this is a terrorist, and it was you, but it mistook you for the terrorist, so now you're under arrest, right? I don't think that has happened yet, but I think it's not impossible. And of course, the most famous one of all these days, driving a car. Right? What is the input and output, in a self-driving car? Well, at a basic level, right, the input is just the camera, right? These days, self-driving cars have all sorts of sensors like LiDAR and whatnot. But the most basic sensor, and indeed, there's this, the world's biggest computer vision company is a company called Mobileye, that it does, things for cars like not just self-driving, but like, lane change warnings and parking and things like that, based on just one camera. So the input again is now is not a static image; it's the video stream of the camera that's on the car, pointing at the road. Maybe more than one camera, maybe more than other things. And what is the output? Well, the output is controlling the steering wheel. It's deciding which direction to turn it in and how much. And then, of course, also the pedals and the turn signals and things like that. But at its most basic level, the self-driving car problem is, give me a video stream, and I will give you, how, where to turn.
But there's also light as an input.
Light meaning?
Light, daylight, nighttime driving.
Well, that's just that's part of the visual input, right? So part of what makes driving a car hard for a computer, but also for people, is that, well, in daylight, good visibility, it's one thing. At nighttime, when you can't see much, it's a much harder one. And often you kind of drive by almost guessing what's there, just based on the few things that you can see, like, for example, the lane markers. So these are some quintessential examples of supervised learning that that you should keep in mind as we go through the different ways of doing supervised learning, different algorithms. But now here's maybe the more important part of this is, like, what are the general classes of problems that these are instances of, right? If somebody comes to you with a potential machine learning application, does it look promising or does it not look promising, right? When you think of applying machine learning to X, right, tonight, as you're about to go to sleep and your brain is active with everything that you saw in class, what makes something a potentially good, supervised learning application versus not? Well, here are some of the things, and these are actually, I think, quite interesting and important to remember. The first one is situations where you cannot write a program to do the job just because you don't know how. Right? Driving a car, as I already mentioned, is an example of this. We don't know how to program a car to drive. The amazing thing is that the car can learn to drive by observing people, right? But here's another very important example. We are trying to come up, and there's machine learning research trying to come up with a vaccine for AIDS, right? Or with a drug that treats AIDS, right? Biologists don't know enough about the AIDS virus and how it works to be able to say, here's how you design a molecule, or here's a program that you give me a molecule and it will tell you whether the molecule will make, a good AIDS drug. That would be wonderful, but we just don't have that. So these are situations where human beings just don't have the expertise to write the program. Either because it's really something that we do at a subconscious level, like driving a car, or because it's something that's beyond, the state of the art in science, like cell biology and finding vaccines and cures for diseases. So this is one very important class of applications. But there's so actually I just lumped together these two different ones, right? So there's the case where there's no human expert. There's the case where we are all experts, right? Except we don't know how to explain it to a computer. Then there's the situations where actually human beings, in principle, do know how to do this. But the problem is that it's changing so fast that you can't possibly pay a human being to do it, right? And a quintessential example of this is the stock market, right? I mean, stock analysts, they know a lot about what makes stocks go up and down and whether something should go up by this much or go down by that much. But the problem is that nobody can afford all the stock, not even the biggest banks, right? They can only afford so many analysts. They can't afford us to look at all the possible data that's relevant to each possible stock, and there's thousands of them. And again, they change very quickly, so something that is good today is not good next week anymore. The machine learning, of course, it's just computers. I'm Goldman Sachs. I have a big server farm. I can just unleash it, and that can keep up with the data. So that's another type of problem where machine learning is potentially useful. And finally, there's the problem. There's the type of problem which again is very important and very common, where yes, if you got a human being to do this, they would do it better than any algorithm. Like, for example, recommending products is a good example of this, right? If you, if you've spent all your life going to a particular independent bookstore, and you talk with the bookstore owner all the time, and, and ask her for what you want, and, no, it wasn't this, that one was better, and she's seeing what you're buying, right? And over time, she's your friend. She knows you very well. She can probably recommend books to you much better than the Amazon recommended system would. But the problem with that is that it doesn't scale, right? A bookstore can do that for, I don't know, a few hundred people. Amazon couldn't possibly do that for its, 300 million customers or whatever they are now. The only way to have that level of personalized service is to have it being done by machine learning algorithms. An even more eloquent example of this is dating sites, right? A dating site is a site that uses machine learning to suggest potential dates to people, right? Now, this is a job that was traditionally done by human beings. They were called matchmakers, right? There was a matchmaker in the village that said, like, oh yeah, you should try to pair up with, that person, like Alice and Bob. They're a good couple, right? Often for reasons that had to do with their families and whatnot, and not necessarily themselves, right? But that matchmaker often had a lot of very deep knowledge of the people. The dating sites don't have that at all, right? Because they couldn't. They're trying to match, 10 million people with 10 million people. What the machine learning algorithm can do is a worse job for each of these people than a really good matchmaker would. But the problem is there aren't enough matchmakers for all those millions of people. So, and the machine learning, what it does, it makes up for its lack of deep knowledge of individuals by being able to learn from many millions of them, right? So it's doing this for millions of people, but it's also learning from the millions of people. So it makes up, for the fact that it's less on each one person by knowing things from much more of them. And you could say the same thing is true for you name it. Now, for Netflix's movies, for the, for tweets, for Facebook posts, for all these different things. Okay, a lot of the personalization that we have today is by doing this kind of machine learning that, in principle, could be done better by a person, but it can only be done economically by machine learning algorithm. Okay, questions? Very good. Now, this is not to say that there aren't good applications for machine learning that are not covered by these, but definitely if something is covered by one of these, it is a promising application for machine learning. And there are many that people just haven't applied machine learning to yet. And maybe you'll be the one that does that. All right, so here in the last 10 minutes of today's lecture is the quintessence of the learning problem in just one small example, right? And if you understand this example, in some ways you will understand everything else that follows and what makes machine learning different from other areas of computer science. If you don't understand this example, let me know immediately, because if you don't, then the rest several weeks will be, won't make a whole lot of sense to you. So here's the example, right? Let's suppose that I have a little black box here, right? It's white on the slide, but conceptually it is very much a black box. And it's a Boolean function, right? This could even be literally a little microchip, right? It's a little TTL chip that's computing a Boolean function, right? In go 4 Boolean inputs, x1, x2, x3, and x4, right? Each one is either 0 or 1. And out comes y, right? Y is just a Boolean function of 4 Boolean inputs. A very, very simple thing, right? This is not going to be a big data problem, right? It's just going to be a very toy example. But it illustrates the key